Hey, what's up? It's Cute What If. This side. Today we will be seeing what if Deku was the League's secret. Before we move ahead with the FIC, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for future what ifs like this. Aizawa narrated that they finally had the info they needed to raid the League. All Might moved to the center of the room and explained that they had the location of the League's main base and would take it that night, leaving in 10 minutes. All Might walked out, leaving Aizawa, Hizashi, Namuri, Kamui Woods, Genist, Hawks, and Edgeshot in the planning room. Aizawa told everyone to get ready and went to his locker. He brought out his binding cloth and watched Hizashi click his amplifier on. Aizawa admitted to himself that he was not an emotional person, but with the mission likely to be the most dangerous they'd faced, he asked Hizashi if he wanted to spend time together. Aizawa thought he sounded foolish. Hizashi looked a little confused for a moment, then grinned and responded with enthusiastic excitement, leaping toward Aizawa while using his quirk. Aizawa smiled and asked him to calm down so his ears would not hurt. Namuri announced that they were leaving, which made Aizawa blush slightly. Hizashi took Aizawa's hand and they ran across rooftops toward a dusty boarding house at the edge of town. With each jump they came closer until they collided and began to fall into an alley. Aizawa caught them with his binding cloth and muttered that maybe they should not do that on the job. Hizashi chuckled, and they continued running, this time keeping some distance between them. Kamui explained the plan. Edgeshot would present the pizza distraction. Once the League was focused, All Might would force a path through the wall. Hawks joked about pizza, but no one else laughed. Hizashi looked like he wanted to join in but held himself back. All Might radioed for Edgeshot to move in and positioned himself with the others a few steps behind. Edgeshot used the pizza as bait and opened the door, and a gust of wind swept through the boarding house. All Might ordered the League to stand down. There was muffled noise and light footsteps inside. Aizawa, who had developed excellent hearing through his underground work, picked out footsteps and a panicked shout calling for someone named Kurigori. As the dust settled, Aizawa saw a blue-haired older teen dart into a purple mist. Aizawa called for the team to secure the villains. They charged through the building and restrained several members. Namuri instructed Aizawa to check the other rooms. Aizawa ran down the hallways until he reached a corridor without any light. A metallic scent hung in the air. The doors along the corridor were marked with large red X's except for one. The door was locked, so Aizawa stepped back and rammed it off its hinges. Inside, the scent was stronger. In the corner of the room he found a small child no older than 9, pale and clearly terrified, with visible burns and scars and signs of long-term neglect. The child tried to hide. The boy mistook Aizawa for Dabi. Aizawa quickly clarified that he was a hero and removed his eraser goggles. The child reacted with fear and disappeared from sight the moment Aizawa reached out. Aizawa scanned the room until he heard a faint whimper beneath the bed and found the child curled up, trying to make himself small. Aizawa, admitting that comforting kids was not his strength, spoke gently and asked the boy to come out. The child shook his head and backed away. Aizawa returned to the front of the building and reported his findings to Hizashi, telling him to get midnight with him. Namuri moved into the room, checked under the bed, said something quietly, and used her quirk to help. Aizawa entered again and lifted the child from under the bed. The boy was small and neglected, marked by old burns and scars and carrying the smell of smoke and disuse. Aizawa reminded himself that the condition he found the boy in was not the child's fault. He brought the child to the front where an ambulance crew was treating several unconscious League members. Aizawa handed the boy to an EMT and explained that the child did not appear to be a willing member of the League and seemed to have a teleportation quirk. He asked them to apply a suppressant as a precaution. The medic took the child and acknowledged the request. Back with the group, they were sharing a light, restrained celebration. Hizashi asked about Aizawa's condition, and Aizawa admitted quietly that he was worried the boy would not fare well in foster care. Hizashi drew closer, promised that they would visit the boy in the hospital, and smiled reassuringly. Aizawa returned the smile. Hizashi theatrically removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes and laughing about the brightness. Aizawa told him to enjoy the moment while it lasted and slid back into his usual impassive expression. Namuri reacted with an affectionate noise at the scene, and Aizawa teased that they should take a picture to remember it. Hawks obliged with a flash from his phone. Later, Aizawa carried Hizashi into his apartment. Hizashi was still laughing as Aizawa set him on the couch and began making coffee. Aizawa said the apartment was a bit small for 2 people and that it was probably better for Hizashi to stay at his own place for now. Hizashi smiled and said they would find a place together soon, then began removing his makeup and hero costume and announced he would take a shower to wash the styling gel out of his hair. Aizawa sat on the couch with his cat Candy nuzzling into his lap. He turned on the TV and eventually picked a horror movie. Hizashi returned 10 minutes later with hair to match Aizawa's and responded with a joking affirmative when Aizawa asked if he liked horror. Aizawa began the movie, and less than 20 minutes in, Hizashi started crying in fear. Aizawa turned off the TV and told Hizashi that he could have said no to the horror film. Hizashi sobbed in agony about why the character had to die. Aizawa's phone rang. A woman on the line identified him as Shota Aizawa and said they needed him at Shizuoka Regional Hospital because a child was distressed and he had been listed as the emergency contact. Aizawa said he would go as soon as he could and told Hizashi to stop being a baby, noting that they were meeting the child earlier than planned. Izuku's point of view shifted to the hospital. He pushed away the people in white trying to examine him, terrified that they would do something to him. Needles made him panic. He scrambled under the bed and kept watch on the door. After a collective sigh, the staff left the room and Izuku crawled out, keeping his eyes fixed on the entrance. When the door reopened, a tall black-haired man stood in the doorway, looking worried. Izuku tried to teleport but could not, and a panic attack overwhelmed him. His vision blurred and he struggled to breathe. The man in the doorway moved closer and calmly instructed him to breathe in and out. Izuku followed the slow rhythm and gradually regained control of his breathing and sight. The man introduced himself through quiet, steady questions, asking what Izuku could see, hear, and feel. He learned that Izuku could only remember his age, and he held up one finger on one hand and 2 on the other. The man understood and then sat in the chair by the bed to ask more. Izuku could remember his birthday, the 15th of July, which he thought might also be the day he had been taken. Aizawa asked if one of his loud friends could come in, and Izuku nodded. Shortly after, a man with an energetic, booming presence entered and greeted him in an upbeat way. Izuku answered softly. The energetic man sat down and smiled broadly, and Izuku gradually calmed in the presence of the 2 adults. A nurse handed something to Aizawa, and when Aizawa returned, he asked politely if he could touch Izuku to help take blood. Izuku hesitated, looked at Aizawa's hand, and then nodded. Aizawa touched his arm gently. The sensation was unfamiliar but oddly soothing. He reassured Izuku that they wanted to help, and when he took the blood it was only a slight prick rather than the painful experience Izuku had feared. After that, Aizawa stepped out to speak with others while the energetic man chatted quietly with Izuku. The energetic man then reached into his bag and pulled out a small ash-colored Pomeranian plush and offered it to Izuku. Hesitant at first, Izuku took the plush and found comfort in stroking its soft fur. For the first time in months, he relaxed enough to fall asleep. Later, Aizawa and Hizashi stood outside the room discussing what to do about the child. Aizawa thought the boy should not be placed in foster care or an orphanage because he clearly had major trust issues and visible scars. He suggested asking someone named Nem to take care of him. Hizashi brightened and hinted that he might want to take the boy in himself, but Aizawa protested that neither of them were fit to be parents, especially for a child with such complex needs. Hizashi's face fell briefly, then he returned to the room and fussed affectionately over the sleeping child. Aizawa went to fetch a doctor and warned that the boy likely had iatrophobia. The doctor removed his coat and entered. When they examined the boy, they found marks of mistreatment, burns and bruises, and a distinct symbol on his neck that suggested involvement by a villain group. The doctor noted each injury clinically, and Aizawa and Hizashi grew increasingly shocked. When the doctor turned the boy, he saw more signs of rough treatment on the torso and back, evidence of serious abuse from those who had held him. The boy stirred, sat up, and quickly red-raped the hospital gown over himself, blushing with embarrassment. Aizawa urged Hizashi to speak with him, and then, after a moment of hesitation, Aizawa relented and agreed to help. Hisashi squealed with delight and hugged Aizawa in relief and excitement. The doctor declared that whatever they were discussing could wait as he emerged from the room. He noted that the child's scars appeared fairly old and that the boy would probably be out in about a month, and that they should take a blood sample the next day to identify him. Tapping his clipboard, he added that a psychologist would check the boy in the morning as he walked away, and then told them they had forgotten a coat. Hisashi and I entered the child's room and saw him trembling slightly. I asked if he was all right. The boy nodded faintly and hugged the plush toy that Hisashi had given him. He looked so small and fragile. He closed his eyes and fell asleep almost immediately. Hisashi and I exchanged a look and left the hospital. I wanted to stay with the boy, but I was exhausted. Once we reached the apartment, we checked the clock and collapsed onto the bed. Izuku woke up in the familiar white room. The black-haired man and the cockatoo were not there. He swung his legs to the side and began to look around. This white room was different from the one the League had kept him in before. He felt the urge to cover the scars that had marked him for so long and told himself he was ugly. He rummaged through the cabinets until he found a jar of lollipops and pulled a few out, sking on them until he had gone through nearly all of them. A white-haired man in a blue jacket, a black t-shirt, and jeans entered. Izuku almost ran but recognized the man's clothes and relaxed a little. The man introduced himself as Natsuo and explained that he was there to talk about the League and to help make Izuku feel better. Natsuo sat on a chair and took out a notebook. Izuku climbed onto the bed and hid his face in the pillow, aware that Natsuo could see the scars that covered his hands and body. Natsuo said he would ask a few questions and suggested simple gestures for answers. Thumbs up for yes and thumbs down for no. Izuku gave a thumbs up when Natsuo asked if the League had hurt him. He gave a thumbs down when asked if he remembered how he had come to the League, and thumbs down to questions about being a soldier, being a child of someone in the League, and being a hostage. When Natsuo asked if he had been an experiment, Izuku swallowed and gave a thumbs up. Natsuo wrote something in his notebook, then asked whether Izuku wanted something to eat. Izuku turned his face and nodded. Natsuo promised to return soon and left the room. Left alone for a short while, Izuku found it odd to be by himself. He had only been alone earlier when the League was on missions, and even then people often came into the room. Natsuo returned with a plate a few minutes later and placed it in front of Izuku. Izuku ate rapidly. Natsuo watched with a gentle smile before taking the plate away. Natsuo informed him that 2 visitors were coming and that the doctor had already obtained information from Izuku's blood. A little later, the cockatoo and the black-haired man arrived in the room. The cockatoo greeted him in an energetic, hyper way, and the black-haired man explained that the cockatoo tended to be a bit overexcited. They bantered playfully for a few minutes until another man in plain clothes entered to announce the results of the DNA test. Izuku listened with a flutter of hope, wanting to know who he was and whether he could return to some life he had lost. The man recalled that the name on the record was Izuku Midoriya, that he was around 12 years old, had no living family listed, had been recorded as quirkless, and had gone missing on his 4th birthday. The black-haired man wondered aloud whether Izuku was truly quirkless, mentioning that Izuku had told their psychologist he had been part of an experiment. They admitted they could not be certain of anything. Izuku spoke up quietly and said that he did have quirks. The men stared, surprised. He explained that others had called him a prototype. The black-haired man asked whether Izuku could demonstrate if they removed the bracelets that restrained him. Izuku nodded and extended his hands. The bracelets clicked off, and he used his ability to heal a black eye. He teleported into the cabinet and brought back the lollipops he had taken earlier, then returned to the bed. For a moment his hair rose and seemed to react, holding the black-haired man in place until it relaxed and the man could move again. He had never used his 4th ability and did not fully understand it, only that it involved wings in some way. Exhausted, Izuku sank back into the bed as the men watched him closely. One of them asked whether he was healed, and Izuku nodded. The other man requested permission to check his injuries. Izuku consented. The man examined the spots where they had previously touched him and remarked that the result was almost as effective as professional recovery methods. They were impressed by how well his healing ability worked, though Izuku knew in his heart that some scars might never fully fade because of what he called a quirk curse. The doctor announced that they could discharge him that day and that there were a few foster homes willing to take him. The cockatoo and the black-haired man shook their heads and said they planned to adopt him. The others objected that the boy could be difficult, but the two insisted that as professional heroes they could handle it. Izuku, unfamiliar with the term, asked what adopt meant. They explained that he would come to live with them and that they would be his parents. Hearing that, Izuku began to cry. The black-haired man offered a small, reassuring smile and reached toward Izuku as if to comfort him, but Izuku teleported away and looked down. He asked quietly that they not touch him. The man immediately raised his hands and stepped back. The cockatoo said he would go get some clothes and left the room. Izuku returned to the bed and tried once more to cover his scars, already thinking that he might get them tattooed over when he was older because they made him feel ashamed. The door closed, leaving him with the black-haired man. Aizawa asked if he liked cats. He tilted his head. He remembered dogs, but cats did not ring a bell. Aizawa produced a small screen and showed a fluffy animal perched on a cockatoo's head. He thought the animal looked soft, almost as soft as Ashi, his stuffed dog. He held Ashi close and, stammering, said that the creature was cute. He then asked for Aizawa's name. Aizawa introduced himself as Shota Aizawa and explained that the loud man outside was Hisashi Yamada, his boyfriend. He tried to smile but could not. It felt as if he had forgotten how. Tears welled up and he began to cry quietly. Hisashi entered the room and asked what had happened. Aizawa explained that it was not the boy's fault and that the boy had simply forgotten how to smile, which made him sad. The boy dried his tears. Hisashi moved to hug him before he could teleport away, and he pulled back when the boy stepped away quickly. Aizawa tapped Hisashi on the head and explained that the boy did not like to be touched. He looked down in shame while the two men spoke softly. Aizawa handed him a pile of clothes and told him to put them on because they would be going outside. They left and closed the door. He changed out of the hospital gown and examined his body. Faint scars and letters marked his legs and arms, but the details of how they came to be were not dwelled on. He put on boxers and jeans quickly, smoothed a t-shirt over his chest, and pulled a hoodie on so he would not have to look at himself. With Ashi in his hand, he approached the door. Aizawa and Hisashi nodded, and they walked together down the hospital corridor past a few people who glanced their way. The attention was uncomfortable but manageable until they reached the lobby. The lobby filled with whispers and pointed stares. Some people voiced cruel curiosity about his appearance and age, and the murmurs grew louder until he felt overwhelmed. He tried to shrink away, but the attention only increased, so he teleported out of the lobby into the parking lot beside a black car. He crouched beside the vehicle and waited as Aizawa and Hisashi searched frantically nearby. Hisashi asked if he had teleported close by, and Aizawa hoped the boy had simply been frightened. When he stepped out from behind the car, the two men rushed to him. He apologized, stammering that he had been scared. Hisashi soothed him and said the people in the lobby had not understood, and he almost hugged the boy before pulling back. Aizawa asked how the boy had known to come to that car. The boy shrugged as the car unlocked, climbed in, and sat down. Aizawa reminded him to fasten his seatbelt. He also noted that Izuku's quirk was regeneration, with the significant drawback that any scars gained would remain permanently. Hisashi noticed Izuku sitting in the back of the car, struggling with the seatbelt. He moved to the back seat and instructed Izuku to focus on the plushie as he clicked the seatbelt into place. He almost ruffled the boy's hair but remembered Izuku did not like that and instead patted the plushie he had given him. Izuku relaxed, and Hisashi returned to the front seat. Sho asked what they should tell Nomuri. Hisashi explained that if they did not say anything, Nomuri would show up unexpectedly and likely frighten Izuku. Sho started the car and they drove toward his apartment. Midway through, Hisashi suggested that Sho consider teaching at UA to keep an eye on Izuku and provide a structured environment for him. Sho looked at Hisashi, asked why his answer would change, then thought it over and agreed to talk to Principal Nizu. Hisashi kissed Sho on the cheek as they pulled up to Sho's building. Sho walked to the door while Hisashi helped Izuku out of the car. Izuku stammered his thanks. Hisashi led him into Sho's apartment. Sho asked if they had plans for the day. Hisashi replied that if they could not remember something, it probably did not matter. As they entered, Nemuri demanded an explanation. Izuku flinched and quickly slipped away. Sho pinched the bridge of his nose and glared at Nemuri, explaining that she had scared his son. Nemuri declared she wanted to spoil the boy, and Hizashi explained that Izuku was shy and did not like strangers. Hizashi called for Izuku and found him cowering in the bathtub. He reassured Izuku that Nemuri was a friend. Izuku slowly stood, hugged his plush tightly, and followed Hizashi into the sitting room where Nemuri and Sho were waiting. Nemuri introduced herself as Auntie Nemuri, and Izuku gave a quiet, stammered introduction in return. Nemuri joked about spoiling him when they needed a childminder. Sho instructed them to set up a movie, but not one that Nemuri and he normally watched. Nemuri suggested a family-friendly option, and Hizashi selected it on the streaming app. They planned to wait for the others, but crying drew them deeper into the apartment. Hizashi found Izuku and Sho in a guest room. Izuku suddenly burst into tears, and Sho comforted him. Nemuri arrived and made a light joke about the bare room. Izuku made a weak smile, hugged his plush, and thanked them. Hizashi offered to watch a movie with him, and Izuku nodded. They returned to the sitting room and settled in for an extended movie marathon. Partway through, Nemuri left and the group began to talk. Izuku did not remember much about his past but recalled a few fragments, the name of a food and the image of certain eyes. Hizashi offered to get a pork cutlet rice bowl for him, but Izuku declined quickly. He also reported seeing a pair of ruby eyes and another pair in gray and blue whenever he slept. The adults did not understand the meaning, but they felt it was important. Sho insisted they were late for dinner and suggested takeout. Hizashi asked Izuku what he wanted, but Izuku was asleep on the couch with his plush on his lap. Hizashi decided to pick up a pork cutlet rice bowl and reminded Sho what he liked before heading out. Hizashi sat beside Izuku and the plush until he sensed shaking under him. Izuku's memory flashed back to a clinical white room, people in white coats, and a figure he thought of as master. Medical staff restrained him and administered a painful injection. He screamed as intense sensations overwhelmed him. A man approached with a sharp instrument and threatened him. The fear and pain became unbearable until Izuku blacked out. When he came to, Hizashi and the plush were beside him, and Sho and another friend were nearby. Hizashi asked if he was all right, and Izuku nodded shyly while stroking the plush. Hizashi explained that Sho had gone out to get food and would return shortly. He asked if Izuku would be comfortable staying with him and Sho, and Izuku, surprised, replied that he would. Hizashi suggested a bath after dinner to help Izuku feel more comfortable, and Izuku tried to remember what that meant, wondering if it was something like a water basin he had seen before. Hizashi explained that a bath was where one cleaned up. Sho returned home loudly and announced that he had brought a pork cutlet rice bowl. Izuku hid at first but then came out when he recognized Sho. Sho placed the food on the table, and Izuku bowed and thanked them before slowly beginning to eat. A few bites in, Izuku's mouth exploded with flavor and he could not help but finish the plate quickly. He grabbed the dish and ate in record time. Sho mumbled that katsudon must be his favorite, and Hizashi said they would run a bath for him when they were done. Izuku stammered his thanks and hugged his plush. A short while later they led him to a private bathroom so he could clean up and rest. After washing and drying off, Izuku relaxed for a moment and then felt something pushing from his back. He turned and discovered two off-white wings. They looked like feathers at first glance, but when he reached to touch them they felt more like metal than fur or feather. He stepped out of the washroom and got used to the new limbs, which made his balance feel different. Hizashi examined the wings and suggested that it looked like a transformation quirk and that Izuku should concentrate on bringing the wings out again. Izuku thought hard and the wings popped forth. They ran a few simple tests. Then Izuku went to the large room he had been given and lay on the bed with Ashi in his arms, feeling more at peace than he had in days. Someone called his name the next morning. Shota stood in the doorway and pointed out that there were clothes on his dresser and that they were going to the mall. Izuku waved shyly and began to dress. He felt self-conscious when Shota lingered and saw his legs, but Shota walked away without comment. Izuku caught his own reflection in the mirror, stared at his scarred face, pulled his hoodie over his head, and tried to steady his breathing before returning to the front room. Hisashi announced that they were going to a cafe for breakfast. Shota patted Ashi's head and motioned toward the door. When Izuku teleported to Hisashi's side in a moment of habit, Hisashi jumped in surprise and asked how he had managed to get there so quickly, calling him listener with a mix of shock and amusement. Izuku reminded him that he could teleport, and Hisashi asked him not to scare him like that again, then pretended to be scared in an exaggerated, joking way. Izuku smiled at the lightheartedness, and Hisashi commented that he was adorable when he smiled. Shota reappeared with a scowl that softened when he saw Izuku's expression, then reminded them they needed to get to the cafe before the rush. In the car, Izuku struggled with the seatbelt until Shota returned to help. He thanked Shota quietly, and Shota nodded and patted Ashi before returning to the driver's seat. Hisashi asked if he was okay with going to the mall, and Izuku told them he would try. The two men exchanged a look and nodded, then set off. They arrived at a cafe with a cup logo and the words Hero Cafe on the side. When they stepped inside, a tall man at the door blocked Izuku and said that only heroes were allowed in. Izuku tried to move past, and the man grew aggressive and threatened to throw him out. Startled, Izuku teleported instinctively to stand beside Hisashi and Shota. The man reached to grab him again, and Shota stepped between them, shoving the man away with his quirk and shouting for him to leave. The man fled. Shota checked if Izuku was all right while Izuku clung to his leg and began to cry quietly. Shota placed Ashi on Izuku's head to comfort him and asked him to stay with Hisashi for a moment while he handled the situation. They were careful not to touch Izuku directly, which he appreciated. When Shota returned, he had the cafe manager with him. The manager confronted the man, told him to leave, and sent him out the door. She then came over to their table and apologized to Izuku for the man's behavior, admitting that he could be rough and was not good with personal interactions. Her tone was friendly and maternal, and she teased Izuku lightly by calling him kid, in a warm way that made him blush. Izuku hid his face and hugged Ashi tighter, feeling embarrassed but comforted by their attention. The woman at the counter said she would get the two's usual and asked what the cutie wanted. The warmth of the moment made Izuku wonder what he was feeling. He thought of his father's suggestion to get pancakes and a warm hot chocolate, and he remembered his father's request that it not be too hot. Hisashi smiled as the woman walked away to the counter. Izuku stammered that if Shota was called Dad, then what should he call Hisashi? Hisashi looked down, giggled, and declared that Izuku could call him Papa. He struck a playful hero pose before Dad gently pulled him down. Izuku managed a small smile for his parents and said he liked it. After breakfast, time passed and Izuku climbed into the car. This time he managed to fasten his seatbelt and felt proud of himself. Papa told him to calm down a little and explained that they were going to the mall to buy clothes and a few decorations. Izuku thanked them for everything and smiled at his parents in the front seat. Dad and Papa smiled back warmly. Izuku hugged Ashi, listened to Dad and Papa talk about decorating his room, and watched the busy streets and large buildings scroll by. Papa announced their arrival, and Izuku unbuckled his belt as they made their way into the mall. Papa decided they should get pants and t-shirts first and began pulling them toward a clothing shop. He selected various pieces and encouraged Izuku to try them on. Each time Izuku emerged from the changing stall, Papa complimented his outfits and focused on him rather than the scars on his skin. When Dad returned with a bag, Izuku asked what it was and Dad called it a surprise, approving the jeans with a smile and a thumbs up. After grabbing underwear and socks, they moved to the hoodie section. Papa recommended some long-sleeve options. Izuku picked a mint hoodie, a green dinosaur hoodie, an all-might hoodie, and hoodies featuring Eraserhead and Present Mike. Dad asked if that was all and Izuku nodded with a small smile. At checkout, the cashier handed the bags to Dad and Papa, then smiled politely as she told them to have a good day. Izuku felt the sting of her expression but followed his parents through an area full of people and restaurants. They lined up at a small sandwich shop. Although Izuku still felt sad about the cashier's coldness, he was comforted by being with people who cared for him. While he examined the menu, a small child tugged at his arm and asked why his face looked different. Izuku grew anxious and signaled to Papa. The little girl repeated the question, and Papa bent down to her level, explaining gently that some people are simply different and that sameness would be boring. He patted the girl on the head and looked to Dad. Dad reached into the bag and produced 2 plushies. He told Izuku to take them and treat them like hugs from his parents. He handed Izuku present Mike and Eraserhead plushies, and Izuku clutched them and hugged them with Ashi. Dad asked which sandwich interested him, and Izuku quietly chose the TLC. Papa teased affectionately about their cute broccoli boy, and reached to pat his head but instead patted Ashi. Dad asked if they had given the plushie a name, and Izuku answered that it was Ashi. Dad said that was a nice name. Izuku tuned out the rest of the surrounding noise for a moment. He overheard rude comments from a few people nearby suggesting that someone like him did not belong, speculating that he might be a villain or have an evil quirk, and comparing him to someone named Dabi. The remarks made Izuku cry. He remembered Dabi as kind on the inside. Dad and Papa realized their attempt to shield him had not fully worked. Dad told Izuku to go to the car with Hisashi while he would address the people. Izuku asked if he could wear a mask to feel more comfortable. Papa knelt to his level and reassured him that no matter what others said, he was beautiful, and that the scars were marks of his past. He explained that they could not change the past, but they could help Izuku feel comfortable in his own skin. He kissed the 2 plushies in Izuku's hands and promised that he and Shoto would always love him. A year later, Izuku stood in the wedding hall as the officiant declared that the ceremony had concluded and invited the newlyweds to share a kiss. Dad and Papa kissed, the hall erupted in cheers, and they walked down the aisle hand in hand. Auntie leaned in to remind Izuku that photos would be taken soon and suggested they head outside. Dad and Papa had kept the wedding small to maintain safety and to keep Izuku calm. He felt a little guilty about that choice but forced a smile for their sake. Outside, Dad and Papa posed beneath a cherry blossom for photographs. Papa called to Izuku by name and the photographer began taking pictures. That night was the first time Izuku stayed away from home, as Auntie said the couple would like some privacy. During dinner at Auntie's house, Izuku asked if they could have a pork cutlet bowl, and Auntie agreed warmly, saying she would get anything for her favorite nephew. She patted Ashi as a way to show affection toward Izuku. They established a system. Patting Ashi was treated as patting him, hugging the Eraserhead and present Mike plushies was treated as hugging him, and if necessary they could hold his arms, which were the least sensitive. The most difficult parts for Izuku remained in his mind and his legs. A woman at the restaurant called that they would get Katsudon, and they quickly sat in front of the TV with their food. 10 months remained until the UA entrance exam. Dad sat me down on the couch with a serious face and told me that they needed to discuss my future. I asked if they did not want me anymore and Dad told me to think about what I wanted to do. I stared at him for a moment and asked if it was not obvious. Papa asked what that meant from the couch, and I explained that I wanted to be a hero, to help people the way they had helped me. I rubbed my thumbs together instinctively. Dad told me to get ready and pointed to the door. I asked where we were going frantically. He said that I had good control but needed some muscle, even with his recommendation. I looked awkwardly at his shoes and told him that I wanted to get in like everyone else, that I wanted to prove I was worthy and not just take handouts. Papa's head popped over the back of the couch with a giddy expression while Dad smirked and called me his problem child. Dad said it was time to get me fit. He brought me downstairs to the car and we slowly made our way to UA. I asked if we were allowed here after hours and Dad said that he and Zashi would be moving to the teachers' dorms once I got in, so they would probably be fine. That did not exactly instill confidence. We arrived at Gym Gamma a few minutes later. It was almost empty except for Mirio, who was always training. Dad told me to do 3 laps with no quirks and pointed to the wall. I knew I should not have bragged, but ever since Dad and Papa's wedding, I had gone out for a run each night. The runs got longer and at this point I could run a marathon without stopping. I completed the 3 laps without breaking a sweat, knocking the smirk off Dad's face. Because I could do more than he expected, Dad said they would move on to sparring. He cracked his knuckles and said that for now I should just attack. Once he decided, then they would properly fight. He motioned for me to attack. I ran at him and, just as I moved to strike, I teleported behind him and thought that he should have been clearer. He activated his quirk and I stopped in front of him. I told him about when people had called me a Nomu, explaining that they said that whenever a 5th quirk was added, the person lost cognitive abilities. I lifted my pant leg to show the top of my thigh and explained that I had found quirk restraints only worked on one of my quirks, my healing, since it had been my first quirk. I hit Dad in the chest to demonstrate my control quirk. Dad asked if I could use my quirks even if he was using his. I closed my eyes and picked him up, saying that I thought I could, but that meant others like that could be really dangerous for him. I told him I did not want him to get hurt and pulled him into a hug while I cried. Dad carefully put his hands on my back and began to cry lightly as well. He told me I was adorable, winked, and then pulled away, saying it was time to get back to training. Exam day arrived. My alarm went off and I shot up quickly, teleporting to the bathroom. I brushed my teeth and returned to my room to grab the clothes I had set out the day before, my Eraserhead hoodie, my best jeans, and All Might shoes. I could not exactly wear a school uniform since I had never gone to school. I teleported to the kitchen where Dad and Papa were waiting. Dad joked that I had taken longer than expected. I said my shoes had been untied. Papa said Nizu wanted us there early and told me to hurry. He was ecstatic. I told them I would be in the car and teleported there, realizing I had forgotten Ashi in my room. I teleported back to grab him and my mask eraser's old goggles and a face mask and then returned to the car so Papa would not be worried. I arrived a second before they got into the car and Dad asked if I had forgotten my mask. I said I was worried people would draw conclusions. We had not decided whether to tell the class or not since I would probably end up in Dad's class. Dad shrugged and started the car. Papa asked if I had studied the night before and I said I had studied until 10. Nizu had taught me for 3 years and I thought I would do well. I smiled and turned my attention to my phone. The only text was from Mirio wishing me good luck. I played a game until we arrived at the parking lot. Papa recommended I go find a good seat in the exam room while Dad took me to Nizu. I nodded, put my mask on, and walked to the exam room. When I walked in, Auntie Nem was sitting in the top chair. I raised my hands to indicate that I was there as a normal student. Auntie Nem remarked that I was wearing a hoodie and covering my face despite her compliments. She always said my scars did not matter and that I was beautiful. I wanted to believe her, but ever since I had been adopted, people had called me and my scars ugly, and that made me doubt whether she was simply trying to make me feel better. I frowned under the mask and sat at the closest desk. Midnight announced that the exam had begun and that we had 2 hours to complete it. I read through the paper and answered each question. Thanks to Nizu's tutelage, I finished the exam in an hour. I handed my exam to Nemuri and walked out of the hall. I teleported to the outside of Nizu's office and knocked. He told me to enter happily and asked what had brought me to his office. I told him I wanted to take off my mask and then removed the goggles and face mask. Nizu told Izuku that when he entered the hero course he would have to keep it off. Izuku asked how Nizu knew he would get in, and Nizu explained that Izuku had aced the written exam and that he was the only person Aizawa had ever wanted to recommend. Nizu took a sip of tea and handed Izuku a cup. Izuku thanked Nizu and smiled at the small creature. Nizu said they were not so different and that he had wanted to help, then suggested they play a game of 4-dimensional chess. Izuku walked into the massive auditorium with his mask on and waited at the edge of the stage, thinking he was out of sight. The school DJ, known to everyone as Papa, burst into the room with an energetic announcement. The candidates remained quiet. Papa started the slideshow and explained the exercise. The candidates would face different types of robots worth increasing points. A blue-haired candidate leapt from his seat and pointed out a discrepancy on the handout, then demanded to know why Izuku was not in uniform and why he was wearing a mask. Izuku felt his face burn with shame and began to remove the mask, but he saw his father behind the blue-haired boy with his quirk activated. Papa quickly called out examiner number 2356 and asked him to sit down, referring to the blue-haired candidate as a distraction. Izuku could barely listen, his eyes filled with tears. Papa encouraged everyone to push themselves, and the room responded with a unified shout of determination. The students headed to the buses for their assigned arenas. After the crowd left, Papa came over and asked Izuku if he was all right. Izuku swallowed hard, removed his mask, and apologized between trembling breaths. Papa took hold of the ends of Izuku's sleeves and pressed them to his chest, telling him not to dwell on it and urging him to go beyond. Izuku wiped his tears, echoed the encouragement, and teleported to ground beta where the other candidates were assembling. A short time later, the blue-haired candidate approached with mechanical hands and asked why Izuku wore a mask. Izuku stammered an apology and inwardly cursed his stutter. He reminded himself this was why he avoided going out. The blue-haired candidate moved on, and Izuku changed into his gym uniform. He had specifically asked his father to make the uniform with long sleeves that covered as much of his body as possible. He waited near the door, aware that Nizu had a mischievous streak and that Papa enjoyed pranks. When Papa announced there would be no countdowns in the real world, Izuku quietly acknowledged the truth and prepared to begin. In the arena, Izuku teleported into action and quickly neutralized a group of low-value robots. He glanced at the debris, tallied 8 points for himself, and continued. He found several candidates trapped beneath broken machines and rushed in to tap the robots, causing them to teleport aside and free the people. He kept moving, taking down robots and aiding those who were hurt or stuck. He was about to tackle a group of mid-value targets when a blonde candidate detonated an explosive quirk that blasted through the metal. The ground vibrated from the force. Izuku turned and noticed Nizu's large demonstration robot looming nearby. He spotted a girl pinned under rubble in the path of a zero-point machine and sprinted toward her. He slid to her side and asked if she could move. She answered that her ankle hurt. Without hesitation, Izuku teleported to the top of the incoming machine, deployed his temporary wings, and anchored them into a panel to destabilize it. As the machine began to tip, he retracted his wings and teleported off, arriving back at the girl to remove the debris. She struggled as the rubble resisted, and Izuku realized he could not free her that way. He placed a hand on her shoulder to steady her for a moment and then teleported them both to the entrance of ground beta. The public address system signaled the end of the exercise. Izuku glanced down at his hands and pulled his sleeves over them. The girl thanked him for saving her, and he responded quietly before vanishing to his car, breathing heavily. His father and Papa both knew the car was Izuku's refuge when he felt overwhelmed. His father arrived a minute later and asked what had happened. Izuku calmed his breathing and admitted that the girl had seen his hands and that he had touched her, which made him panic because he was uncomfortable touching people he did not know. His father rummaged in the car and handed him a small stuffed dog named Ashi, advising him to focus on the toy and reminding him that the girl was likely grateful rather than frightened. Izuku held Ashi until his breathing returned to normal. His father invited him to come along to see Hizashi, and Izuku accepted. They went to the command room where the teachers watched the exercise. All Might greeted Izuku warmly, and Izuku returned the greeting. Power Loader complimented Izuku's temporary wings and asked where he had made them, which made Izuku tense because he had forgotten the teachers had been observing. He rubbed his arm and avoided answering. Nizu smiled and praised Izuku's effort, saying they could not reveal his score but that he had done well. Izuku thanked his teachers and credited his mentor. He sat beside Papa, who gave him a conspiratorial wink before making the final announcement that acceptance letters would arrive in 2 weeks. As they left, Izuku's father reminded them they needed to check on the house. They said goodbye to acquaintances and headed out. On the drive, Izuku asked his father if he knew anyone who was definitely in his class. His father mentioned Endeavor's child, a girl who could create devices, and a small, endearing student with green hair. Izuku asked about the green-haired student's quirk, wondering briefly if it might link to someone from his past. Papa and his father began laughing and explained that they had been referring to Izuku himself. He mentally face-bombed as they climbed into the car. 2 weeks later, the day finally arrived. For the last fortnight, his father and Papa had teased him about whether he had been accepted or had failed. The moment he had been waiting for was at hand. Izuku Aizawa woke up and followed his usual routine. Papa announced that Izuku's letter had arrived, and Izuku teleported to his father to take it. He opened the envelope slowly, and a small disc popped out, projecting a hologram of All Might. The hologram introduced itself and displayed footage of people Izuku had saved approaching the control and offering him some of their points because he could have earned more. All Might's hologram revealed Izuku's scores: 143 hero points without the robots and 198 with them, the highest in UA history, and welcomed him to the Hero Academia. When the hologram faded, Izuku stood in stunned silence. Papa smiled and praised him for the accomplishment. His father handed him a uniform with a wink and said he was looking forward to watching Izuku surpass the other problem children. Izuku stammered his gratitude and began to cry. His parents assured him warmly. They explained they needed to start packing to move to the teachers' dorms, where an extra room had been prepared so Izuku could visit whenever he wanted. While his parents went to their room to pack, Izuku collected his own things. 3 days later, Papa shouted that it was Izuku's first day. He teleported to the bathroom, took a quick shower, dried off, brushed his teeth, dressed, and returned to the kitchen. Leaving the apartment where he had lived for the past 3 years felt bittersweet, but he was excited for school. The car ride to UA Academy was quiet but full of anxious energy. His father told him he could head to class and that he would arrive shortly. Izuku walked to his classroom in high spirits, but his excitement dimmed when someone muttered about how odd he looked. He quickened his pace and entered the huge classroom marked 1A, finding a seat. The room held an unusual scene. A blue-haired student was scolding another for resting his feet on a desk. The blue-haired student, demanding respect for the school's rules, introduced himself as Tenya Ida when he turned to Izuku. Izuku replied with his name. Ida apologized for inquiring about Izuku's mask and examined him politely, prompting Izuku to wonder if the boy had much practice talking to people. A sudden, unexpected tap on his shoulder startled Izuku and he instantly teleported to the other side of the room. The girl who had tapped him apologized and thanked him for saving her during the exam, explaining that she had wanted to express her gratitude. Izuku noticed a yellow duffel bag on the floor, kept his expression steady, and sensed that something important was coming. A calm voice cut through the class. Shota Aizawa stepped forward and introduced himself as their homeroom teacher. He instructed everyone to put on their uniforms and meet on the practice field. He handed uniforms to the students, except Izuku, who teleported to a locker, retrieved the custom uniform his father had made, changed, and then teleported straight to the grounds. His father stood watching the field and reminded him that he could not hide his quirk forever and that eventually he would have to show everyone. Izuku had seen this quirk test before. He knew his father could be serious in a way that made the situation feel tense, then dismiss it afterward as a logical maneuver. The class assembled for the quirk apprehension test, the same basic exercise they had done in middle school but now with quirks. Because Izuku had ranked highest on the entrance exam, he was called to stand in the circle and throw the ball as far as he could. He walked into the circle and teleported the ball straight to the moon. The distance registered on the field system, and his father reacted with a subtle, proud smile. The teacher asked if Izuku could retrieve the ball. When Izuku concentrated, the ball reappeared, hovering above his father's head. Students murmured with a mixture of awe and competitive chatter about the hero course and what it meant for the rest of them. Their teacher let slip that if they expected the course to be fun, the student who finished last would be expelled, an announcement that silenced the room before later clarifying that expulsion was an exaggeration but that those who performed poorly should be wary. The rankings were announced: Izuku Aizawa in first, Shoto Todoroki in second, Katsuki Bakugo in third, followed by the rest of the class and, near the bottom, Minoru Mineta. When the exercise ended, their teacher told them to change back and return to the classroom. He then left the field to rest. The class surged forward, but Izuku teleported ahead and returned to the classroom early. He stowed his uniform and found the dorm area where some students were already settling in. His father was curled up and resting, looking exhausted but content. Katsuki Bakugo was the first back from the lockers and confronted Izuku aggressively. Bakugo reached toward him, but Izuku recoiled and teleported away. He begged not to be touched. Bakugo sneered at the contrast between Izuku's appearance and his powerful quirk and peered into his eyes with an intensity that made Izuku uneasy. Izuku asked if Bakugo looked familiar for a reason. Bakugo dismissed the question, implying there was no way Izuku could know him. Izuku lowered his voice and revealed that he was adopted and that his old name had been Midoriya. He asked Bakugo if the name meant anything to him, explaining that he had no memories before his 4th birthday and that he often saw eyes like Bakugo's in his dreams. He confessed that he wanted to know who he had been. He said this quietly, hoping Bakugo would understand, but kept the plea between them. A boy looked over Izuku for a second, then his eyes shot open as he asked if he was Deku. Izuku said he did not remember. Another student insisted they meet in the dorm after class. The class grew loud while Izuku stayed still. Ida then called everyone to attention and recommended that they introduce themselves and list their quirks. The class went around. Izuku was grateful to be last. He stammered his name as Izuku Aizawa and asked that no one ask about his quirk or touch him. The room fell awkwardly silent. Everyone stared, likely at the scars along his neck. Aizawa spent the rest of the PRD explaining hero costumes and telling them to start designing theirs. Izuku already had a design that mixed elements of his father's and his own. When the PRD ended, he went to the cafeteria and took the first thing he found, then sat alone at a table. No one dared come near him. Todoroki sat down across from him without speaking and began eating soba, staring. Izuku started to walk away, but Todoroki calmly grabbed his sleeve and gestured for him to stay. Izuku noticed Todoroki had the same unusual eyes he had seen in his dreams. His gaze kept drifting to the burn on Todoroki's face. Todoroki asked why Mr. Aizawa had stopped Ishido from asking a question and whether Aizawa was Izuku's father. Izuku replied quietly that Aizawa was not his biological father. Todoroki then commented on the scars covering Izuku's body. Izuku pleaded for the topic to stop and began to cry. Todoroki apologized and admitted he was not good at being sensitive, and then he added that he knew a dangerous group called the League of Villains and that Izuku's neck caught his attention. Izuku asked him to stop reminding him he was different. At that moment, Aizawa appeared with his quirk activated and asked why his child was crying. Izuku told Todoroki he would explain later. Aizawa's expression softened briefly and then he walked away. Back in the classroom, Uraraka and Ida addressed Izuku, asking if Aizawa was his father. Izuku nodded and looked away. Ida offered a formal apology about the incident at the entrance exam and bowed properly. Izuku accepted, saying the others had not known. The pair left to talk with Uraraka, leaving Izuku alone. He reached for Ashi, but the plush was not in his bag, and he began to panic until Aizawa entered and dismissed the class, saying they had the rest of the day to set up in the dorms. In the dorm common area, Bakugo asked Aizawa if Izuku could teleport other people. Aizawa explained that he could, but he did not like being touched. Bakugo asked Izuku to take him to the dorms. Izuku hesitantly extended his pinky. Bakugo linked his own, and although Izuku flinched, the pair teleported to the Heights Alliance dorms. Bakugo rummaged through boxes, tossing things aside until he pulled out a framed photograph showing a smaller version of himself and a boy who looked almost exactly like Izuku. Bakugo set the photo beside Izuku's head and said the boy in the picture looked like him but without scars. He asked if Izuku remembered the name Kaken. That question unlocked memories for Izuku. He remembered being a child with Bakugo and how his mother used to make katsudon for them. One memory stood out. They were playing in a park when Bakugo's hands began to crackle with explosions. Bakugo showed off, celebrating that he had gotten his quirk, and he held out his hand to promise they would be the strongest heroes together when Izuku's own quirk appeared. They smiled at each other and in that moment, hugged. It had been the first hug Izuku had had in 11 years. Bakugo then asked how Izuku's scars had happened. Izuku explained that he had not even told Aizawa or his other parent what had happened. Bakugo grew angry and demanded to know more. When Izuku prepared to leave, Bakugo grabbed his wrist roughly, startling him. Izuku's quirk flared in a sudden surge that made his hair lift and his eyes glow. Bakugo's grip went slack, and Izuku teleported away. He arrived back at his dorm and set up the small space before a knock sounded at his door. Todoroki stood in the doorway with an apologetic expression and offered an apology for bringing up sensitive things earlier. Izuku accepted and invited Todoroki in. Todoroki sat on the bed while Izuku paced and tried to explain how everyone looked at him with pity and treated him like a weirdo. Izuku admitted he could not talk about it because revealing it would only make people pity him more, and added that he had not shown anyone his arms since he was very young. Todoroki offered to listen and allowed Izuku to share as much as he wanted. Each mark on her skin told her something about who she was. She thought of the words on her legs and the familiar litany of self-blame, awkward because she had never been to school, unable to tell anyone about her quirk, treated like an experiment, like useless property. She collapsed onto her bed beside Todoroki and saw him crying. He asked, knowing she did not like to be touched, if he could hug her. She dried her tears and nodded. Bakugo barged into the room, demanding to know why Deku was crying and what Icy Hot was doing there. Todoroki, still holding the hug, noted that she had met Deku only hours earlier and yet given him a nickname. She explained haltingly that she had known Bakugo before something had happened, and Bakugo asked gently if she would tell him what had happened. She asked for a moment and requested that Bakugo get the plush on her desk. He raised an eyebrow but handed it over. Todoroki released her and she hugged Ashi. Another knock sounded at the door and Bakugo opened it to let their father in. Their father looked between her and the two boys with concern and asked what had happened. She told him it was fine and stood up holding Ashi. Todoroki and Bakugo exchanged a glance while their father mentioned that he had a gift for her costume and left quickly. Once they were alone, Todoroki observed that present Mike was married and had a child who was now number 1 in the class, and Bakugo agreed. She giggled and sat back on the bed, then invited them to watch a movie. They all agreed and she put on Lilo and Stitch, a movie that had been her favorite since her first day with Dad, Papa, and Auntie Namuri and that helped her feel grounded. They ended up watching 3 more films. Around 7 in the evening, a pink-haired classmate suggested they play Truth or Dare. She did not want to at first, but Bakugo and Todoroki insisted. She told them she needed to get dressed, shooed the 2 out of her dorm, and covered the keyhole with a towel. She grabbed an Eraserhead hoodie and some pajama bottoms and stepped out to find Bakugo and Todoroki in their pajamas. Kaminari greeted them from the couch and she sat on the floor, away from the others. The game began with Ishido prompting Aoyama for a choice. After a few rounds it was Yaoyorozu's turn to ask Aizawa for Truth or Dare. She chose Dare, and Yaoyorozu asked for every cute picture of Mr. Aizawa she had. She admitted she did not have anyone's number and then showed the class the photos she kept in a folder on her phone. As the class swiped through, they reacted with soft sounds of appreciation until they reached an image she had forgotten to delete. She hurriedly swiped the phone away and explained that they were not supposed to see that one. The picture had part of her back exposed, where a distinct mark shaped like a Y was visible. When it was Todoroki's turn, he chose Truth and said his favorite heroes were Edgeshot or Kamui Woods. The game continued through several more rounds until Mineta asked her for Truth or Dare. She hesitated then chose Truth. Mineta asked, with a cruel grin, where she had gotten those scars. The question sent her spiraling, memories and visions crowded in. She could feel panic rising in a way that was different from before. This was not just a memory. It was a sudden vision of a place full of strange artificial beings in tanks, like the ones used in the experiments that had defined her worst days. Overwhelmed, she teleported to her room and locked the door. She gathered Ashi, Mike, and Razor her plushies and started to cry. Shouts came from outside the door. Someone called for her to open the door. She thought she saw Master at first, then Bakugo's face in her mind. She forced herself back to the present and stayed curled up with her plushies. Todoroki begged Aizawa to open the door, and she ignored the pleas a little longer. Then she opened the door and asked between sobs if she could just see Dad. Their father told the others to go do something else, and closed the door behind him. Their father stood in the room, worry written across his face, and said he had received a report that Mineta had been chased around campus by the class except for Bakugo and Todoroki. She tried to speak but her sobs took over and her father could only try to soothe her, though he still would not touch her back. Papa arrived soon after, anxious and wrapped in a leather jacket, and asked if she was all right. Their father explained that Namuri was handling the rest of the class and that he would talk to the 2 who remained. She clung to her father's jacket and cried into it, hating the scars because they reminded her of the worst times, the forced experiments, the way people had spoken and stared. Papa murmured comforting words nearby. Their father pulled Papa aside to go to the office to file a report, leaving her with Todoroki and Bakugo. Todoroki asked if she was okay. She stood and shuffled to the bathroom without locking the door, trying to dry her tears and think of happier things. She removed her shirt for a moment and traced the marks. It saddened her, but this time it did not make her break down further. She settled into the bathtub with her plushies, the cool metal of the tub calming her as she tried to sleep. After a while the door opened and Todoroki announced that it had been half an hour. She realized she had been exposed and quickly pulled her hoodie over herself. Bakugo asked if she was okay. She remained seated in the tub, crying quietly while Todoroki leaned over to speak to Bakugo, and Bakugo took a sharp breath. Kaken stormed over and gently lifted Izuku out of the bath, carrying him to the bed and setting him down with care. Bakugo told him that he was going to prove something, staring him down while tugging at the hoodie. Bakugo explained that he had been Izuku's friend before the scars and would remain a friend despite them, and that he had even developed feelings for people with scars, ending with an awkward, embarrassed gesture. Aizawa and Deku were asked together if Izuku could show his scars. Izuku began to cry and said that the scars were ugly and made him ugly. Todoroki responded softly that nothing could make Izuku ugly, and Bakugo added with force that he would deal harshly with anyone who said otherwise, punctuating his words with a few controlled explosions. Izuku slowly pulled his hoodie off to reveal the scars on his torso and arms. Bakugo moved close and placed a hand on Izuku's cheek, saying calmly that the scars changed nothing, and he smiled. Todoroki looked genuinely happy and agreed, reminding Izuku that he was still the only person who could beat Todoroki in the quirk test. Bakugo protested in mock frustration. Izuku thanked them, saying that he needed that, and when Todoroki asked if there was more, Izuku replied quietly that there was not tonight. Izuku heard Todoroki mutter something to Bakugo that made Bakugo blush and call him a rude nickname, which made Izuku giggle. Both boys blushed and turned away. Izuku thought to himself that they were weirdos, then checked his phone before deciding to sleep. The two smiled before leaving the room. Izuku heard them muttering, then talking, and finally a loud agreement. He looked down at his body and realized the scars no longer looked as bad, they seemed to fade in his own eyes, and it made him happy that Bakugo and Todoroki had helped him with his self-consciousness. Izuku woke up around 8 in the morning and started his routine, careful to put Ashi in his bag. He teleported to the common space, which was mostly empty, and made a quick bowl of cereal before checking the time. He grabbed his bag and teleported to the classroom, where Bakugo, Todoroki, and Ida were the only ones present. Ida asked if Aizawa was okay after yesterday's events. Bakugo lied that Izuku was fine and that it had just been a panic attack, adding a formal apology on behalf of Mineta and bowing. Ida left, and the three were left to talk. Bakugo recalled that when Izuku had left the room the night before, his hair and eyes had done the same unsettling thing as when Aizawa erased someone's quirk, and Bakugo admitted that he had been unable to move. Izuku confessed quietly that he had multiple quirks. Bakugo and Todoroki shouted in surprise, and Ida scolded them for shouting in the classroom. Bakugo dismissed the reprimand and demanded an explanation, but Izuku said he could not talk about it then and that he did not like to discuss his quirks. Bakugo clicked his tongue and sat down. Later, their teacher arrived with a sour look and announced that they had something important to discuss. He said that there were 19 people in Class 1A and that he and All Might had planned mock battles, but they needed to find a replacement for Mineta. All Might then burst in loudly, proclaiming his presence and announcing that the day would be spent on gauging their hero skills. All Might emphasized that the first part of being a hero was being fashionable, pressed a button, and their costumes popped out of the wall. The class grabbed their hero outfits and headed to the locker room. Izuku teleported to the locker room and quickly put on the underlayer so he would not have to show his body. The rest of the class arrived as he tucked his goggles on. Todoroki commented in his usual tone that Izuku looked good, and Kaminari joked that he looked like a mix of Mr. Yamada and the teacher. Todoroki glanced between Bakugo and Izuku. Izuku shrugged and teleported to ground beta, where All Might greeted him warmly. Izuku returned the smile and mentioned that talking to a few classmates about his scars had made him feel less self-conscious. All Might advised Izuku to use only one quirk during the exercise since not everyone knew about his past. Izuku nodded as Bakugo and Todoroki joined them, followed by the rest of the class. All Might announced that they would be doing mock battles, with one team as villains and one as heroes, and that the heroes would try to capture the villains or disarm a bomb in an open building. He said he would step in if things became too dangerous and decided to draw teams by lot. The relevant pairings were revealed. Todoroki and Izuku on a team, Bakugo and Kirishima on the opposing team. Team Todoroki and Izuku were assigned heroes while Bakugo and Kirishima were the villains. They were given 5 minutes to prepare. Todoroki asked if there was a plan. Izuku reasoned that both he and Bakugo could potentially end the fight instantly, but that Bakugo would want a real fight. Izuku proposed drawing Bakugo away from the bomb so Todoroki could freeze Kirishima. Todoroki argued that heroes should stop the threat as quickly as possible, but Izuku countered that predictability could be a disadvantage and suggested that the villains might have someone positioned to move the bomb. They agreed to the plan and charged in. Todoroki surged into the building and Izuku teleported in front of Bakugo, who taunted him and set off a few controlled explosions. Izuku whispered that he intended to draw Bakugo away. Bakugo charged with a barrage of explosions. Izuku teleported out of the blast and reappeared behind Bakugo, delivering a clean strike to Bakugo's back that sent him to the floor. Bakugo admitted that Izuku had a good hit, then grinned and got up, showing a gauntlet and warning that it was more than just decoration. Bakugo pulled a pin, triggering a large blast of energy that closed in on Izuku. Izuku teleported instantly away, but his goggles fell behind in the chaos. Izuku landed in the room with the bomb and found Todoroki engaged with Kirishima. Todoroki ordered Izuku to get to the bomb. I nodded and charged toward the bomb. All Might announced over the PA that the heroes had won and asked everyone to return to the command room. Kirishima complimented him, calling him manly as he slapped him and Todoroki on the back. He jumped and teleported as usual and arrived beside Bakugo, who was cradling his goggles and muttering about I-5 being responsible. He told Bakugo that no one could kill him that easily. Bakugo screamed in surprise when he realized who it was, reached out, then stopped, still steamed. He apologized awkwardly, explained that the plan had required the scare, rubbed the back of his neck, and picked Bakugo up from the ground. Kirishima, Todoroki, Bakugo, and he walked to the command room where All Might praised their use of the other team's tactics and moved on to the next group. He sat on a bench and traced the scars along his arm, feeling people stare but choosing to be alone. He took comfort in small normalcies, going to school, having friends, not having to hide his face all the time. Bakugo snapped his fingers to bring him back to the present. He apologized and Bakugo told him not to apologize, only to huff in typical fashion. They watched the last few fights until All Might dismissed them back to the dorms. He teleported back to his dorm, changed into regular clothes, and scrolled through his phone. A call came from his father asking him to come to the faculty lounge. His father explained that it would be difficult but necessary. He needed to explain his past. His father promised that he and Shoto would be there to support him. He sighed and teleported to his side. He leapt into his father's arms, startled. His father scolded him gently, saying he preferred him alive over dead, and his other parent pouted. They exchanged a light, tense joke about coffee. His father warned that several teachers and a few familiar pros were in the lounge and told him to stop at any point if he felt uncomfortable. He nodded and walked into the room. Nisa greeted him from his oversized chair and asked him to share what he knew, explaining that they suspected the League had advanced its quirk experiments and needed information. He sat down, looking away from the teachers, and told his story as if speaking to Bakugo and Todoroki. He believed he had been taken on his 4th birthday. He did not remember everything, but meeting Bakugo had helped. The League had taken him to a facility and put him into a containment of some kind. A few days later they administered the first quirk, regeneration. He pointed to his scars and explained that he could heal as long as his heart and brain remained connected, but the scars would never fade. After a year or two they gave him a teleportation quirk and labeled him Prototype Nomu No. 6. Over the following years they forced him to use his abilities against captives and pushed him through harsh training. Eventually they sold access to him to raise money. At 10, a new member joined the League on the same day he received his 3rd quirk. That person helped bandage his scars and offered comfort. One evening that man told him about heroes. He said that even if heroes were flawed, he hoped they would help and stop the planned Nomu program. He explained his understanding that after receiving 5 quirks a person could become a mindless monster. The League planned to give him another 6 to test the limits of someone who had been quirkless, but he was rescued the day after he received his fourth quirk. He let his wings unfurl for a moment and then folded them back. He asked the room not to tell anyone what he had revealed. Silence followed. The teachers and pros reacted with anger or tears. He asked if everyone was all right. His father said it was a lot to process and looked at him with sympathy. Niza granted him permission to return to his dorm. He bowed, teleported away, and made his way home. Back in the dorm, the hardwood under his shoes triggered a surge of panic. He clutched his plushies and hugged them tight as his body began to tremble. He ran to the bathroom, changed quickly, and took advantage of the private bath provided because of his situation. He pulled his wings in, sank into the warm water, and let the tears come. He stayed there for a long time until a knock sounded at the bathroom door. The door opened and Todoroki stood there. He asked for a minute to himself. Aizawa was in the home office correcting a student's Japanese homework when he heard heavy, uncontrolled breathing. He found Izuku visibly shaken and damp from a bath in the kitchen. Aizawa coached him to regulate his breathing with slow, steady inhales and exhales until he calmed. He asked what had happened. Izuku explained that Todoroki had accidentally entered while he was bathing and he had panicked, so he had come to the first place he could think of. Aizawa fetched a set of clothes for him, handed them over, and told him to return to the dorms and ignore the awkwardness while Aizawa spoke with the class. He informed his partner that they were leaving and warned him not to be late because of a movie night. Aizawa and Izuku walked back to the dorms in silence. He probably thought that I did not know the eyes he saw when he slept belonged to Todoroki and Bakugo. I watched as he calmed himself with slow breaths and playing with his hood. Just as they arrived, he teleported away, leaving me to address his class. I entered the common space and waited until they noticed me. Ashido jumped and poked the others. I told the class calmly that I had a small request. I stared at Bakugo and Todoroki and demanded that no one ask Izuku about his scars or touch them. Yaoyorozu noted that Izuku was my son and asked why he had scars. I said I would ignore her borderline insubordinate tone and explained that it was not my place to tell them and that Izuku took time to warm up to people. I left quickly and sent Izuku a text encouraging him to socialize a bit. I knew he did not like it, but heroes had to talk to people. Todoroki's perspective. Mr. Aizawa had just left. The class stayed quiet for a moment until Kirishima produced a Switch and invited everyone to play Smash Bros. They bantered back and forth as they chose characters and began a match on Battlefield. After a short, competitive game, Bakugo won and gloated, rubbing his victory in their faces. Todoroki laughed, thinking of their shared affection for Aizawa and the possibility that Bakugo felt similarly about him. Bakugo scowled at the laughter but only managed to blush instead of lashing out. Todoroki said he was going upstairs and asked to be called for dinner, then headed toward Aizawa's room. He knocked and waited. After a sigh, the door opened and Izuku stood there, looking distressed. Todoroki apologized for walking into the bathroom earlier. Izuku said it was fine and that the whole Mineta incident had thrown him off. Izuku invited Todoroki in and stepped away briefly. Todoroki focused on Izuku's face rather than his scars and looked away when the moment became awkward. Izuku explained that his father insisted he socialize and that he would be in the common room. He offered a weak smile and left the room. They paused at the elevator, awkward and quiet, before following the rest of the class back downstairs. In the common area, the students debated activities. Ashido suggested a room tour, which the others thought sounded fun. Bakugo crossed his arms and warned that no one extra would enter his room, while Aizawa suggested maybe Deku. They agreed to start with the first-floor rooms and piled into the elevator. Aizawa teleported separately. The first room on the tour belonged to Aizawa, and he stood awkwardly outside as he opened the door and admitted there was not much to see. The class filed in slowly to look around. Kirishima noticed one of Aizawa's plushies and tossed it at Bakugo while joking that there were 2 Pomeranians in the room. Bakugo huffed and set the plush down. Todoroki silently hoped Aizawa had not noticed. They moved on to Kirishima's room and, floor by floor, toured the dorms until they reached the top level, where only Todoroki's and Bakugo's rooms remained. Todoroki had his sister and brother help make his dorm feel like their house, and the others reacted in surprise to small details. The last stop was Bakugo's room. Bakugo blocked the doorway without complaint. Aizawa teleported away for a moment and returned with an all-might toy, which he placed on the couch and admitted it brought back memories of a favorite action figure from childhood. Bakugo snorted but did not protest when Aizawa kept it. Someone suggested voting on the best room. Sato won by handing out cake to the girls, and Todoroki came in second. The class gradually drifted away until only Todoroki and Aizawa remained in the common area. Aizawa sat on the couch with a cookie and the all-might figure. When Todoroki asked why Aizawa had taken the toy from Bakugo's room, Aizawa admitted it reminded him of his own childhood and smiled faintly. From the stairs, Bakugo shouted that Deku was one of the main reasons he was training to be a hero, which made Aizawa tear up with emotion. Bakugo sat down beside them, and Aizawa pulled him into a sudden hug. Bakugo did not complain, and Todoroki thought that Aizawa could bring out a softer side in him. Later, as everyone prepared to head to bed, Aizawa stood up and hurried toward the stairs, blushing as he went. Bakugo asked Todoroki if he was all right. Todoroki observed that Aizawa's scars seemed to run deeper emotionally than he let on. Bakugo rolled his eyes and said it was obvious they had a story behind them. Todoroki sighed and suggested giving Aizawa time, noting they could not force anything without risking his ire. Bakugo accepted the idea with a gruff agreement and turned on the TV as the night settled over the dorm. I made my way to my room and slumped into bed. I was asleep in minutes. The next day, Mr. Aizawa collapsed onto the floor and said he hadn't gotten any sleep, so the class needed to stay quiet. Kirishima asked rhetorically whether he did that often, and Aizawa replied with a quiet laugh that it happened sometimes. The class chuckled and broke into small groups. When Aizawa was alone, I walked over to him and commented that it wasn't like him to address the whole class that way. Aizawa glanced at the teacher and then at me, explaining that his father wanted him to socialize and that the class were the only people who didn't insult his scars. He rubbed the back of his neck, stood, and added with determination that he might as well do as his father wanted and please him and Papa. I told him that, if that was his only reason, it seemed foolish, and I asked in a low voice why he was really acting differently. Aizawa sat back down and looked at his desk, admitting softly that this was how he normally was and that no one had wanted to come near him. He had tried to avoid making us hate him. I felt bad and reached to rub his back, but a harsh hand landed on my shoulder. Bakugo demanded in a low, threatening tone what was going on with Icy Hot. I said that it was fine and only something in my eye. Aizawa looked over, smiled, and warned in a clipped tone that he hoped that was true before walking away. Aizawa strode over to Azui and Uraraka. I tried not to hover but realized I had been staring. Tokoyami introduced himself and asked if I was Todoroki. I confirmed that I was, and he then asked why I was staring at Aizawa. I replied that I had been intrigued by what had happened the previous night. Tokoyami closed his eyes and suggested that they shouldn't speculate. Aizawa would explain himself someday. I hoped he would, then returned to my desk. A minute later Mr. Aizawa reminded the class to be on time for combat training, yawned, and was replaced by Mr. Yamada, who announced the day's lesson. Izuku's perspective shifted. His father had told him to follow him instead of going to combat classes because of a present. Izuku asked if it was the same present their papa had mentioned. His father nodded and began walking backward, commenting that, as useful as Izuku's quirk was, it wasn't the most combat efficient. They walked to an open wooded area near UA, and his father produced a box. Inside was a dark gray binding cloth. His father explained that the company had owed him a favor and that the cloth worked the same as his. He instructed Izuku to take off his shirt and wrap the cloth tightly. When Izuku managed it, the fabric covered his arms and back and felt strange at first. His father showed him that a piece of the cloth should rest in front of his right hand and told him to grab it and make it move. Izuku concentrated, and the cloth began to float. His father told him to wrap him up and stood still. Izuku imagined his father entangled, opened his eyes, and found the cloth attached to a nearby tree. His father laughed, said Izuku had missed by a bit, and urged him to practice. His father arranged to teach him every Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday. He bumped cloths with Izuku and left. Izuku thought about hugging him and felt the brief brush of contact as his father huffed and walked off. He softly grabbed his father's hand and teleported back to the teacher's dorm. His father slumped onto the couch and immediately fell asleep. Izuku covered him with a throw. His father mumbled a nickname for Izuku before snoring again. Izuku went to the kitchen to make lunch. He had been learning to cook to eat better and found a bag of shrimp, deciding to make tempura. He prepared the batter and heated it. Just as he placed the last piece of vegetable on the plates, the front door opened. His other parent arrived and removed a jacket. Izuku produced the binding cloth, explained that his father had given it and then fallen asleep, and said he had made food. His parent asked if Izuku cooked like him or like Shoto. Izuku confidently said he cooked well and beckoned him toward the kitchen. His parent admired the tempura and told him it tasted really good. Izuku modestly replied that it was not as good as his parents' cooking. His parent assured him it was genuinely good. Izuku noticed two pets, Kofi and Candy, perched on top of his sleeping father in a funny way, snapped a picture quietly, and returned to the kitchen. His parent asked about the photos. Izuku said he liked taking cute pictures. After saying goodbye to his parent, Izuku teleported back to the dorms. A few students were sitting in the common room. Kaminari greeted Izuku and asked why he hadn't been at combat training. Izuku explained that his father had wanted to do personal training focused on his quirk. Shiro added that they hadn't missed much, since the class had been doing situation analyses with Cementos. Ida looked like he wanted to explode. Ashido suggested playing Mario Kart. The narrator chuckled and admitted that they had not played many video games. Kaminari laughed that they could not be worse than Shiro. Shiro shouted that at least he knew how to avoid blue shells. Ojiro from the kitchen observed that that only mattered if someone was in a position to get hit by a blue shell. The narrator could not help but laugh, which drew the class's attention. The narrator tugged on the binding cloth and it performed the familiar, menacing motion their father always used. The narrator asked if there was a problem with a cheeky grin. Todoroki from an armchair commented that the narrator's laugh was cute. The narrator blushed and adjusted the cloth. Kirishima asked if the narrator had always had the cloth, and the narrator explained that their father had said the quirk was not very combat effective, so a support friend had made it. The narrator teleported to the couch and suggested they race. Kirishima grinned and handed over a controller. The next day, their father announced from the front of the class that instead of normal lessons, they would be going to an off-campus facility for rescue training. He instructed everyone to get into hero outfits or P uniforms and be ready in 10 minutes before leaving. The narrator grabbed goggles and a P uniform and teleported to the locker room. Kaken must have known what was happening, because he arrived almost immediately and burst the door down. The narrator used the binding cloth to cover their back while Kaken took off his uniform. Kaken remarked that the narrator would have to show their gear eventually. The narrator replied that maybe, but they did not know the others well enough yet. After changing, the narrator let the cloth relax, placed the goggles on their head, and walked toward Kaken. They counted down slowly from 10. Kaken fitted his gauntlets as the narrator reached 1. The narrator lightly took his hand and teleported them both to the bus, sitting on the pavement. Kaken noted that the narrator had gained confidence. The narrator smiled and said this was how they normally behaved. Kaken laughed that when they were kids the narrator had been nervous and awkward, and the narrator teased that Kaken had once been softer. Their father looked at them from the bus and offered a subtle smile, one he reserved for the narrator or their father. Todoroki asked from the narrator's side whether Aizawa could smile. Their father huffed and set his face back to its usual blank expression. The class arrived at the facility and they quickly boarded the bus. Their father raised his voice to quiet the noisy students and told them to settle down. The class responded in unison. Todoroki asked Aizawa if he had his capture weapon. Aizawa said he still needed to train Todoroki. Todoroki whispered that he had forgotten, and the narrator noted that Aizawa had never told the class about his multiple quirks. The narrator promised to tell Todoroki and Kaken after school but cautioned that they might not be pleased. The narrator and Todoroki continued to talk until the bus arrived at a giant dome. They filed inside and found 13 waiting. 13 explained that they would be doing various rescue training exercises and reminded everyone that quirks could be used for destruction but also for saving people. Uraraka began to fangirl over 13 while the rest of the class looked around at the different training zones. Kirishima exclaimed that the place was epic and pointed out the fake villains in one area. The narrator spotted the distinct blue hair and hand mask among them. Suddenly their father shouted for 13 to protect the students, pulled down his goggles, and rushed down the stairs to confront a group of villains. 13 instructed everyone to gather and make their way outside. As the students moved toward the exit, Kurogiri appeared and blocked the way while addressing the narrator as number 6. His presence expanded ominously. The narrator froze as his yellow eyes fixed on them, and he threatened that if they did not return, their friends would be harmed. The narrator tried to back away but tripped as Kurogiri advanced. The narrator teleported to Nizu's office to call for help and then returned to the dome. The class became separated, though a few students helped 13. When the narrator reached her, they saw she had suffered severe injuries. Looking down, the narrator saw their father facing off with Master. The narrator grabbed the binding cloth and ran to the railing, silently begging that things had not gone too far. Master ordered one of the creatures to attack, and one of the bird-like Nomu charged out from Kurogiri. The narrator teleported to their father's side and moved him out of the Nomu's path. They slipped out of the creature's sight and waited for it to double back. Master mocked the narrator for returning and taunted that they could not beat a Nomu during training, let alone now. The narrator saw their father managing to hold his own and heard Master cackle while goading them to help their father. Their father shouted for Izuku to get out, insisting he would handle the situation. The narrator glanced at him and then at the angry Nomu. The narrator shook their head and raised the cloth, concentrating on stopping the creature. The cloth was slow to respond, but the narrator and their father charged together. The Nomu seized both of their heads and began to slam them toward the ground. The narrator activated control over the cloth and forced the Nomu to drop their father. The narrator felt their heads strike the floor repeatedly until darkness closed in. They heard a distant voice calling before losing consciousness. When they came to, they were in a small room with 4 people, a young woman with scars, a first-generation hero, a middle-aged man, and a man with wings. The narrator offered a hesitant greeting. The young woman introduced herself as Aki Shizenji and said she had the ability Tella. The Gen 1 hero and the others introduced themselves as Kantor Aizawa and Hain Ito. The narrator asked whether Aizawa was related to their father. The middle-aged man explained that Shoto had been his grandson. Tella then explained that when the narrator's quirks had been transferred, their consciousness had been placed deep in the narrator's subconscious. The narrator processed that 4 people were now sharing a place in their mind. Shizenji added, with a playful glint, a question about which of their classmates they found more impressive, Todoroki or Bakugo. I blushed and looked away. Ito laughed and told Izuku to ignore her, explaining that she always talked about who he would end up marrying. Tella introduced himself and the others and explained that they had come to introduce themselves because Izuku had been through so much pain that Aki's quirk had put him into a light coma. Shizenji added that he would wake up in 2 days. Izuku thought of questions until one difficult one came to mind. He asked if they were dead. Ito replied sadly that they were, and explained that Dr. Garaki had intended their quirks for a Nomu but the quirks had been put into Izuku instead. Izuku apologized, saying he felt like a Nomu and was sorry for causing their deaths, his eyes filling with tears. Kantor countered that Izuku was human just like Bakugo or Todoroki, that he simply had powers that belonged to others. Kantor straightened and helped Izuku to his feet, insisting that being seen differently because of a quirk did not make him less human, that he was not a test or an animal. The 4 of them smiled, and Izuku's vision went black. Izuku slowly felt his senses returning. His ears registered beeping and his eyes adjusted to the light. He noticed an 4 and a heart rate monitor to his left and an older woman in a white coat to his right. He panicked and teleported into the cabinets, hearing her stand up and walk away. He forced himself to breathe slowly as he adjusted to being awake again. It had felt like a short dream, though Shizenji had said it would be 2 days before he woke. The door slammed open and 2 pairs of footsteps approached. His father called for him to come out and said it was only him and Zashi. Izuku curled up further inside the cabinet until his father, with a worried look, opened the door and placed Ashi in his hands, guiding his breathing with quiet, even counts. Following his father's instructions, Izuku calmed. His father muttered about forgetting to tell Chio to take off her coat, and Izuku nodded shyly before looking around the room. The walls were white but not sterile like a hospital. He stood and dusted himself off. His father asked if he was all right, and Izuku sat on the bed and asked the time. His father checked his watch and said it was around 2 p.m. on Saturday. When Izuku asked when he could leave, his father said Recovery Girl knew about his regeneration and that he could go home that day. Izuku asked frantically if the class had been injured. His father reassured him that most of the villains had been low-level thugs and that the class had mostly escaped harm. Only one person had been hurt in a situation that could have been fatal. Izuku's father gave him a stern look. Izuku apologized and hugged him, and his father returned the hug with a soft grumble about Izuku being a problem child. They lingered until a knock at the door and a feeble voice asked to come in. His father identified Recovery Girl and explained that she needed to check his injuries. Recovery Girl entered and motioned to the bed. She asked Izuku to remove his gown for examination. He obliged, wary of people in white coats even if his father trusted her. She inspected the new scars carefully. Izuku's wounds were healed but noticeable. His father produced a hand mirror and told him to stay calm as she showed him. He braced himself and then opened his eyes to see a prominent healed wound on his forehead with another scar intersecting it. Izuku pushed the mirror away, and Recovery Girl teased him not to hurt himself again because dragging Aizawa out of her room had been difficult. He laughed and rose to leave. Outside the room, his father muttered a remark about Recovery Girl, and Izuku smiled up at him, telling him he appreciated that he had stayed by his side. His father teased that Izuku had become more adorable. A girl with blue hair called out in surprise at Aizawa smiling. The girl was Nijire Hado, and she was asked by someone standing nearby named Hado to be quiet. Mirio approached with his characteristic smile and asked how Izuku was doing. Izuku admitted he was shaken but alright. Nijire asked if Mirio knew Izuku, and Mirio replied that Izuku was Mr. Aizawa's son. Nijire reacted loudly to the revelation that Aizawa had a son. Izuku introduced himself with a bow, and they made small talk as they prepared to leave the building. They headed to the car together. Izuku's father told him he would need to explain how he had healed to the class, so Izuku would be staying in their dorm until Monday. They all climbed into the car. Izuku's other parental figure offered to help him with his seatbelt, teasing gently. Izuku asked if his father had seen his phone. His father produced it from his pocket as they pulled out of the parking lot. Dad told Izuku in a stern voice that because he had gone against their wishes and gotten hurt, he was grounded from his phone. Izuku sighed and accepted his fate. Dad said he would give the phone back on Monday. Izuku forced his focus on the town as they drove. He rarely came to this part of town. The people there were cold and many of them called him a villain and worse. The only friendly place was the Hero Cafe. Even after a rough first visit, Yua at the cafe was always kind. The car stopped and the door opened. Izuku stepped out quickly despite a few murmurs and walked into the cafe. An unfamiliar bouncer requested to see their hero licenses. Izuku exhaled inwardly as Dad presented theirs one by one, Eraserhead followed by Present Mike and Izuku. The bouncer nodded and let them through. They approached the counter. The barista greeted them and asked what they wanted. Dad ordered an Eraser special, a black coffee with extra espresso. Papa ordered an iced Americano. Izuku, stuttering, asked for hot chocolate. The barista said he would bring it right away. They took a booth and fell into uneasy silence. Izuku's thoughts kept returning to the League and the Nomu. Now that they knew he was still alive, would they come for him? Would they hurt Dad or Papa? What about Katsuki or Todoroki? Were there more Nomu, or had they developed intelligent ones? Could Dabi be used to trick him? How had they known about the USJ trip had they had a spy? What if a master foe attacked? Papa asked if Izuku was all right. Izuku touched his face and realized he was crying. Dad checked on him too. Izuku looked at both of them and pulled them into a tight hug, not letting go until the barista arrived with their drinks. He thanked them quietly and released Dad and Papa from the embrace. They sipped their drinks and sat with the tension thick in the air. A familiar voice announced his arrival at the doorway. Hawks, the number 3 hero, walked in and chose a seat with casual familiarity. Dad muttered that he had not seen him in years. Papa greeted Hawks warmly. Hawks admitted he had been scared to hear there had been an attack on UA, and Izuku winced at the reminder. Dad, Papa, and Hawks talked for a while, which eased the tension. Izuku answered Hawks's questions softly when asked how he was doing, admitting that the USJ had been frightening. Hawks eventually left and they followed in kind. On the drive back the silence returned. Papa asked why Izuku had been crying. Izuku admitted his thoughts had wandered to a bad place. Dad tried to reassure him, telling him he had really acted like a hero. Izuku smiled inwardly and stared out the window. His reflection showed the scar across his face. He traced it slowly, the skin had knit back but the scar still held stitches. He poked it. Like the others it did not hurt. They arrived at the teacher's dorm 10 minutes later. As soon as they did, Izuku teleported to his room and searched for his binding cloth. He found it, put it on, and thought back to USJ, remembering how he had failed to save Dad there. He gripped the cloth tightly and promised himself he would not fail again. He ran to the kitchen for a water bottle and set it on his desk. He concentrated on the cloth, angry that it would not respond. Imagining the bottle as an enemy, he squeezed his grip until the bottle crumpled as if crushed. Dad walked in with a weary groan and asked what was wrong. Izuku demanded to know how the cloth worked. Dad shrugged that he did not know, only that it seemed to respond to the way Izuku gripped it. Izuku, frustrated, insisted he could not be expected to not know how to use it. When he squeezed the cloth again with anger, it shot up, latched onto Dad, and lifted him off the floor. Dad explained that Izuku had gripped it angrily and it had reacted. Papa called for Izuku to wake up and get ready. Izuku grumbled but followed, teleported to the bathroom, brushed his teeth, and dressed in his uniform. He sat in the kitchen while Dad and Papa prepared their things. Izuku said he would explain his regeneration and teleportation. Papa told him he would have to explain how he obtained those powers as well. Dad, still half asleep, reminded Izuku that he needed to be careful. Katsuki would likely react immediately and want to confront the League. When Izuku mentioned he had seen something that triggered a memory of Katsuki, Dad and Papa sprang to attention. Izuku explained that on the first day Katsuki had shown him a childhood picture that had brought back a memory. Dad and Papa reacted with surprise and concern. As they left, Dad advised Izuku to keep his explanation focused, mentioned that he had multiple quirks and described the ones he had already demonstrated. Izuku asked if they always left this late. Papa complained about having to wake 2 people that morning. Izuku apologized for not liking to talk about his past. Dad told him not to be sorry and asked if he would teleport them to the staff room so they would not be late. Izuku asked for his phone back. Dad took it from his pocket and handed it over. Izuku hugged both of them and then teleported them all to the staff room. Papa looked confused while Dad appeared shocked by the hug. Auntie Nem wondered if he could teleport other people. He explained awkwardly that he could, but only when he had to touch someone. Auntie Nem smiled, teased that he was becoming more interesting every day, and feigned a pout before winking. He giggled as the bell rang and everyone dispersed, with him and Dad heading toward Class 1A. Dad instructed him to stay while walking through the door. He heard shouting and Dad trying to calm the others, and Dad reassuring everyone that he was all right but that he would need to explain things later. He kept his breathing steady and his mind clear before opening the classroom door. The class turned toward him, probably expecting a bandaged wreck, but they only saw another scar. He gave a small wave. Yaoyorozu wondered how he had healed so quickly. He sighed and moved to the center of the front of the class. He told them there had been a serious reason for his reluctance to explain his quirk. He admitted that, through means he preferred not to describe, he had acquired multiple quirks, including the teleportation they had already seen and a regeneration ability that allowed him to recover from injuries. His tone grew somber as he spoke. The class reacted in stunned silence, barely able to respond. Bakugo immediately refused to accept any implication that this would make him unbeatable, shouting that it did not change anything. The class's attention shifted to Bakugo, which made him smile inwardly. Kirishima and Ishido chided Bakugo for his attitude. Dad used his quirk to quiet them and reminded everyone that surviving the USJ did not mean their struggles were over. He sat down as the class grew worried about the villain threat. Dad then announced that the UA Sports Festival would be held on Saturday, a declaration delivered with a knowing smirk that prompted a collective sigh from the students. He stifled a laugh. Dad had already warned him so he would not panic. Dad explained that personal training would take place in Gym Gamma. They went through the rest of the morning as usual. At lunch, Bakugo and Todoroki escorted him to the bathrooms. Bakugo suspected that none of his visible quirks accounted for the changes in his appearance, and Todoroki asked if there might be more quirks than he had revealed. He fidgeted with his thumbs and then decided to tease them a little. Using his ability, he briefly influenced Todoroki's hair and eyes and guided him to the sink. Todoroki covered his hands with water and then returned to Bakugo. Bakugo questioned whether he could control people. Bakugo scoffed and was soon surprised when Todoroki slapped him under his subtle direction. Bakugo erupted in outrage. He relaxed his appearance and laughed, while Todoroki tried to suppress his amusement and Bakugo clenched his fists in anger. He apologized to Bakugo for the prank. Bakugo insisted that he would defeat him at the sports festival and stormed out of the bathroom. He and Todoroki laughed as they followed. Outside their classroom they found a group of students blocking the doorway. Bakugo was trading insults with them while a purple-haired student explained that they were scouting competition and reminded everyone that general education students could be transferred to the hero course, and vice versa. Bakugo bristled and moved to strike. He stepped closer and put a hand on Bakugo's shoulder, apologizing for his hot-headed friend. A different student mocked his appearance, and a few other jeers followed. The purple-haired student frowned at the remarks. His smile faded. He shoved the purple-haired student aside and told the group firmly that he did not understand why they were there. He challenged their priorities, telling them that their focus seemed more on making an impression than on improving their skills. The purple-haired student responded with a superior remark about innate quirks. As he was about to react, Todoroki pulled him back into the empty classroom and shut the door. Only Todoroki, Bakugo, and he remained. Bakugo complained that he did not need help and fretted that outsiders might think he was weak. Frustrated, he punched the wall, and Todoroki murmured that Bakugo's attitude might be rubbing off on him. Bakugo smacked his head while he continued to vent at the wall. Todoroki asked him to stop berating the wall, so he fell silent and returned to his seat with a huff. Conversation could be heard outside until the door opened and Kirishima and Kaminari entered, asking about the crowd. Todoroki explained that general education students were trying to intimidate them. Kaminari remarked on rumors about a student who had been expelled, and not wanting to deal with the fuss, he teleported away to avoid further interaction. Later in the hallway, Dad asked why he was there. He admitted that he had felt like talking with his parents, a little white lie that Dad noticed but let pass. Dad produced a box of chocolate-covered biscuit sticks and offered some. They shared a quiet moment chatting before heading back to class. A few general education students lingered by the door, including the purple-haired student, who stepped up and apologized for his classmates' behavior. He explained that he understood what it felt like to be labeled a villain and offered a small bow of remorse. He accepted the apology and noted that, sadly, he had grown accustomed to such treatment. He chose not to elaborate on his past, only he and the pro-heroes knew the full truth. He and Dad walked past the student and returned to their seats. The class prepared for combat training. Dad announced that they would go to Gym Gamma to train with ectoplasm and instructed everyone to change into their gym uniforms. He swiftly teleported to the locker room and put on his uniform, being careful not to snag his capture weapon. He decided to concentrate his training on that device. Even though he could not use it during the sports festival, he wanted to improve so he could challenge the league and work toward rescuing Dabi. He is good in him. From what Izuku knew, the man had been thrown out after his younger brother was born, and his father had found no use for him. It was a sad story, and what made it worse was that he didn't really like being a villain, but he had a record and everyone hated him, so he couldn't escape it. Izuku teleported to Gym Gamma and walked to his father's sleeping bag. He tugged on his cloth, making it pop out of his sleeves, and lightly pulled until it grabbed his father's chest. The sudden yank sent his father tumbling out of the sleeping bag. His father joked that he regretted giving him that, and Izuku replied snarkily that they both knew it made him feel closer to his father. His father nodded toward Kirishima, Todoroki, and Ishido and said that now those three knew. Mina shouted that it was so cute, and Ectoplasm placed a hand on her shoulder and recommended they keep it quiet because the man didn't like being seen like that. Izuku laughed and led his father safely to the ground. The rest of the class arrived, confused by Ishido's excitement. Their father announced that Ectoplasm would be creating clones for everyone to train with and warned them not to destroy the clones. He glared at Bakugo before slumping back into his sleeping bag. Ectoplasm produced 19 clones and sent one to each student. They all separated to different areas of the gym. Izuku had his Ectoplasm clone stand by so he could concentrate on different styles of capture. He tested a few techniques before attempting something his father had warned against: swinging off structures. He concentrated on a girder and grabbed his cloth, pulling himself forward and repeating the motion to cross several beams before becoming caught in another binding cloth. His father observed that it was too dangerous, and Izuku argued that he could teleport before hitting the ground. His father gave him a look and slipped back into his bag, telling him to train his quirk and that he would teach him how to do it properly after his internship. Izuku noticed Bakugo glaring at Ectoplasm, looking poised to attack. Their father turned toward them and shouted at Bakugo to stop while using his quirk to intervene. Izuku chuckled and returned to his Ectoplasm clone to practice unconventional attacks. When the bell rang, they headed back to the dorms. The next week of school followed a similar rhythm. The general ed kids gave up on Tuesday. Izuku woke at 7:45 and quickly got up. He teleported to the bathroom, put his gym uniform on under his hoodie, and then teleported to the kitchen to make a bowl of cereal. Todoroki sat beside him with his own cereal and they ate in silence until the rest of the class arrived. Kirishima asked if everyone was ready for the festival. Bakugo threatened softly that he was going to destroy them. Others expressed excitement and, in a light moment, someone admitted being scared of Bakugo. Bakugo protested that he wasn't scary and demonstrated with a few controlled explosions, which made a few people chuckle as they grabbed breakfast. Izuku teleported to his room to grab his mask and gym uniform. His father had said he could wear the goggles, but not the lower part of his mask. He picked up Ashi and teleported himself and the items to the commentator's booth, placing Ashi in the corner while he changed into his gym uniform and goggles. He teleported back to the dorms so he could walk to the stadium with either Bakugo or Todoroki. Todoroki was already leaving alone, so Izuku teleported to his side and asked to walk with him. Todoroki agreed and wondered why Izuku was already changed. Izuku explained that arriving at different times would be awkward for the class. They chatted until they reached the massive stadium. Todoroki left to change while Izuku waited in the Class 1A area. The intercom called Izuku Aizawa to the principal's box. He teleported to the box and found his father beside Principal Nizu. His father waved and greeted him, and Nizu acknowledged him through the rim of his teacup. Nizu explained that he wanted Izuku to choose the general education student who would transfer to the hero course. His father shrugged while Izuku sat open-mouthed and asked why him. Nizu replied that Izuku was excellent at analyzing quirks and seemed able to sense a hero a mile away. Izuku agreed to take on the responsibility as long as he could still participate in the events. His father affirmed the arrangement, and Izuku left the box by falling backward and teleporting just before touching the ground. When he reappeared, he found Bakugo occupying his previous seat with his large combat boots. Izuku took the seat beside him while Bakugo talked with the group that called themselves the Baku Squad. Bakugo warned Izuku not to go easy on him. Izuku said he never would. Bakugo insisted he was serious and puffed out his chest, claiming he would win this time. Kirishima asked why Bakugo was suddenly so aggressive. Bakugo insisted he was only speaking the truth. Izuku stepped back and teleported to the bathroom to clear his head. He splashed water on his face and pulled his goggles down over his eyes. Exiting the bathroom, he avoided the curious looks from his classmates until he accidentally bumped into a purple-haired boy. The boy asked if he was all right and apologized for his peers. Izuku replied that he was fine and accepted the apology with a nod before teleporting back to the waiting area. I avoided Kaken's death glare and thought that he was acting odd. The intercom announced that we should proceed to the vomitorium and introduce the classes from 1H to 1B. I took a breath while Papa announced that next up were the survivors of a villain attack, Hero Course Class 1A, as we walked into the huge stadium. I looked around and felt suddenly nervous. The UA Sports Festival was one of the most popular events in Japan, so it was no surprise the stands were packed. We filed into our class groups while Auntie Namuri appeared on stage. The other students murmured about her costume until Auntie Namuri cracked her whip, which quieted them instantly. Auntie Namuri then announced that before the events they would hear a speech from Katsuki Bakugo of Class 1A. I thought that this would not end well as Katsuki climbed to the top of the stage. Katsuki Bakugo declared that he was going to win, and the stadium went quiet. Boos rose from the stands and the other classes. Papa called for him to dial it back. Katsuki returned to his row and Auntie Namuri calmed the students. Auntie Namuri announced that it was time for the first event and spun the wheel behind her. The wheel stopped on erase, and Auntie Namuri instructed all students to go to exit B. We made our way toward the exit while Papa explained the rules of the race. I kept a stoic face even though I knew I was likely to place first. I had practiced teleportation and trusted it would get me to the finish. Auntie Namuri counted down and signaled the start. I ran out of the exit and dodged other competitors until I reached the outside. I saw Todoroki creating ice on the ground, and when the cold reached my legs I teleported straight to the finish line. Papa then announced the first place winner as Izuku Midoriya from Class 1A, and a ripple of confusion spread through the crowd because they did not know about my teleportation. I turned my attention to the arena screens to watch the general education students. The purple-haired boy had chosen a creative strategy and had teammates carry him through part of the course. I wondered what his quirk might be. A few others performed well, though many still seemed unsure how to make the best use of their quirks. I glanced back toward the exit to see Katsuki Bakugo and Todoroki battling for second place. Katsuki released a powerful explosion that pushed him ahead for a moment, but Todoroki surged past him a second later. Papa shouted at Eraserhead, asking what he had been teaching his students, and Dad responded that he had not taught that tactic and that all his students had trained hard to reach this level. Papa continued to complain about Eraserhead being a terrible teacher while Dad grumbled under his breath. Papa then announced the remaining winners. The 40 winners, including me, returned to formation for the next event. Auntie Namuri congratulated the winners and rolled the wheel again. After several spins, the wheel landed on the human cavalry battle. Auntie Namuri explained the rules and announced that we would have 15 minutes to form teams. I quickly ran to the side of the stage to ask Auntie Namuri a question. Auntie Namuri bent down and asked what was up with her favorite nephew. Izuku asked whether the rider would be allowed to leave the horse's shoulders or arms. The aunt replied that as long as they did not touch the ground, they would be fine. The narrator thanked her, smiled, and ran to find Todoroki. The narrator told Todoroki that they knew how to win instantly. Todoroki replied that it would be easier to just take the 10 million headband from them. The narrator asked whether he would be able to get it from them. Todoroki pondered for a second, raised an eyebrow, and explained that teams had to have at least 2 people and the rider's only rule was that they could not touch the ground. The narrator moved their eyes, forgetting that Todoroki could not see them. Todoroki smirked and said the narrator could just teleport into the sky repeatedly. The narrator agreed and asked if he would be on their team. Todoroki nodded and offered a handshake. Todoroki outlined the plan. Once the game started, he would jump onto the narrator's hands and then teleport into the sky, making sure he remained visible. They confirmed the plan and prepared for the game. He shrugged and told Todoroki to just stay standing, which made him chuckle. Todoroki responded with determined confidence that he understood and they were going to win. Auntie Nem announced that the cavalry battle was beginning. I jumped onto Todoroki's palms wearing my all-might boots and teleported to a high point in the stadium. I hadn't done this in a while, but the league used to make me do it for fun. If I touched the floor before Master wanted me to, I would be punished. I'm pretty good at it. Papa shouted that Izuku Midoriya was staying above the competition and asked whether that was even allowed. Dad replied that the rules stated the rider could not touch the ground, and on a technicality I had not broken any rules. I smirked at that answer and began to do small tricks while falling. I looked down at the arena and prepared for the next move. Kaken blasted toward me wrapped in Siro's tape. I figured Siro could catch him if he fell, so it felt worry-free. I teleported slightly to the side, careful not to leave the arena. Kakin charged, trying to grab my headband, so I teleported to the opposite side. He was pulled back to his group while shouting. I looked over at Todoroki and saw him making ice sculptures. I chuckled and continued my teleportation loop. Below me a purple-haired kid stood with several Class B and A students, all with fully white eyes. I kept doing flips and a few spins until the game ended. Todoroki smirked and commented that it had worked like a charm. He added that he would have to make a big impression in the fights since he had taken the easy route for 2 of the events. The announcer said there would be an hour-long break and mentioned recreational activities during that time, cautioning that the 16 contestants moving to the next round could play but that it was not recommended. She finished with a sharp crack and dismissed them. I teleported to the commentator's booth to spook Dad and Papa. Dad smirked, said I had been predictable, handed me a bento box, and told me to eat while slipping into his sleeping bag. I jumped into Dad's chair with Ashi in my lap and began to eat. Papa smiled and said it had been a very creative way to avoid a team listener before turning to his own bento box. We chatted for a bit until I decided to walk around the stadium. I turned a corner and saw Endeavor blazing toward the waiting rooms. He stopped when he saw me, narrowed his eyes, and glared down at me. He told me that I had better use them all. My eyes shot open under my goggles, and I asked what he meant. He answered that we both knew that I would be facing his son and he wanted to prove that his son would be number 1. I stepped back and asked how he knew about that. He reminded me that he was the number 2 and that of course he would be informed about a human Nomu. I wanted to slap him. He treated Todoroki like an extension of himself. I teleported to my designated waiting room and ran into Ojiro. I asked him what was up. Ojiro said that the purple-haired kid would be my first opponent and that his quirk allowed a form of control. Once Ojiro had answered one of his questions, the boy was able to control his every movement. I thanked Ojiro, told him I would handle it, and prepared for the mysterious purple-haired boy. Papa announced with excitement that they were back and that the first fight was happening right now. Dad introduced from Class 1C the mind manipulator Hitoshi Shinso. Papa introduced from Class 1A the teleporting enigma Izuku Aizawa. We walked into the stadium again, moved to the concrete slab, and bowed as ordered. Auntie called for the match to begin. I ran toward Shinso until he started talking. He asked, with a sad smirk, what the hero course was like. I thought that he did not want to insult me. I teleported to his back and struck his side. He reacted that it hurt and asked if I was going to take it easy on a general education kid, smiling a little. I teleported to his front and nodded. He sighed that he would have to fight, and removed his arm from his side. He charged quickly and hit me in the side. I teleported behind him and kicked the back of his knee, sending him to the floor. I waited for him to get up, then opened with quick kicks and a few punches, backed off, and ran toward the edge of the slab. I teleported at the last moment to avoid being counted out, used the built-up speed to teleport behind him, and struck his back with all my force. I grabbed his sleeves and threw him toward the edge of the ring, then ran in and told him I would see him in class on Monday before delivering the final kick that sent him out of the ring. Auntie announced that Hitoshi Shinso was out of the ring and that Izuku Aizawa had won. The crowd cheered. I smiled and teleported to Nizu's spectator box. Nizu greeted me and asked what had brought me up to his box. I told him that I had made my choice. He sipped his tea, looked down at the current fight, and asked to hear it. I explained that Hitoshi Shinso's quirk had not helped him in the entrance exam but that he had heart and a very useful quirk. Nizu smiled and used the intercom to call Hitoshi Shinso to the principal's box. I teleported to the 1A stands. Ojiro complimented me on my fight, and I told him his advice had helped. I looked down at the arena and saw Katsuki Bakugo fighting Achiko Uraraka. Uraraka was holding her own but using a lot of energy to maintain a trap. Bakugo realized what she was doing just as she dropped a ton of rocks on him. He was struck by only one rock before Uraraka collapsed. Auntie announced that Achiko Uraraka was unconscious and that Katsuki Bakugo had won. The stands began to boo, showing no mercy. Dad spoke up to quiet the stadium, saying that Bakugo had acknowledged the strength of his opponent and had acted accordingly. He suggested that those who disagreed might consider a different profession. The stadium fell silent. The next matches went quickly. I was next against Todoroki. I saw him staring at me from his exit and wondered why Bakugo and Todoroki were taking this so seriously. Papa announced that it was Class 1A's Shoto Todoroki and Izuku Aizawa. We moved to the slab and began. Todoroki immediately attacked with a wall of ice spikes that I dodged. He realized he needed faster attacks and jumped at me, freezing one of my feet. I teleported behind him and kicked his back. He turned with visible anger and said that drawing the fight out would make things clear, that he would not use his quirk in the way people expected. Another ice wall came toward me. I teleported to his back again and swept his legs out from under him. I taunted that he had not even made a scratch on me and yet he was trembling. He launched me off him. He asked whether I wanted him to use the fire side of his quirk, then sent 2 ice walls at me in unpredictable patterns. I barely dodged by teleporting to the tops of the walls. I shouted that people did not know what it was like to have a quirk that did not belong to you and insisted that the quirk was his, not mine. Todoroki stood in shock for a second, then his left side burst into flames. Endeavor shouted encouragement from the stands. Both Todoroki and I glared at him before turning back to each other. Todoroki thanked me quietly and then charged with flames billowing. I teleported behind him, grappled his shoulders, and threw him as far as I could. He managed to stop himself with ice at the edge of the arena, but I kept up the pressure. I teleported in front of him and struck hard, breaking his ice and sending him toward the stairs where he fell out of bounds. Auntie declared Shoto Todoroki out of bounds and Izuku Aizawa the winner. I teleported to Todoroki's side and found him unconscious. I teleported him to Recovery Girl's office and laid him on one of the beds. Recovery Girl arrived a few seconds later with a worried expression and asked if she could check him. I told her I would stay. I narrowed my eyes and said that, as much as Dad and Papa trusted her, I had reasons to remain. She sighed and began to check Todoroki. Ms. Midnight reassured him softly that it was just quirk overuse and he should wake up soon. She told him to head back to the stands and promised she would not touch the fallen student. Izuku Aizawa nodded and teleported to the stands. Eijiro Kirishima praised him for a good job. Tsuyu asked if Todoroki was all right. Izuku explained that Todoroki had not used his fire much, so it had been simple overuse. They chatted for a bit before turning their attention to Tenya Ida's match. Ida faced a girl with vine-like hair whose quirk worked better at long range, giving Ida a clear advantage. He quickly forced her out of the arena and the announcer called her out of bounds, declaring Tenya Ida the winner. The next 2 fights were uneventful. Mina Ishido lost to Fumikage Tokoyami, and Eijiro Kirishima lost to Katsuki Bakugo. Izuku moved toward the exit, but the intercom interrupted. A family issue had forced Tenya Ida to leave the stadium, and Izuku Aizawa would move straight to the finale. He teleported back to the stands and wondered aloud what had happened. Hantashiro suggested it could be Ida's brother, Ingenium. Kyokajiro said it must be serious for him to leave the festival. Bakugo and Tokoyami began their match. Izuku thought that Dark Shadow, being a shadow, would be weakened by light, and that this would put Tokoyami at a disadvantage. Bakugo unleashed a powerful explosion that made Dark Shadow retreat, and Tokoyami conceded when he realized he could not win. The announcer called Katsuki Bakugo the finalist, and Izuku felt his body tense with nerves. Eijiro Kirishima asked if he was all right. Izuku admitted he was nervous because Bakugo could be intimidating. He rose and said he would wait in a room, walking to the first available one to calm himself. The door swung open and Bakugo pointed out it was his room. Izuku apologized and explained he had taken the first empty one he could find. Bakugo warned him not to expect any mercy. The intercom requested the final contestants head to their exits. Bakugo threatened him again, and Izuku rolled his eyes before teleporting to his exit. The stadium announcer introduced Izuku with a loud, enthusiastic flourish, and his father, commentating at the mic, sounded a little exasperated. The announcer then introduced Katsuki Bakugo in his usual fiery manner. Both finalists walked to the slab and bowed at one another. Auntie Namuri's concerned expression was clear from the stands. The match began. Katsuki Bakugo charged with explosive power. He landed a quick strike on Izuku just before the teleporter could get away. Izuku landed on the other side of the slab, clutching his arm to steady himself and waiting for the minor injuries to calm. Bakugo realized what had happened and charged again. Izuku teleported behind Bakugo and tripped him by targeting the back of his knees, a tactic he had used successfully before. Bakugo staggered, then turned and fired explosions from his right arm. Izuku dodged while taking mental notes on Bakugo's fighting patterns and teleported backward to analyze further. Bakugo taunted him, and Izuku pushed Bakugo's sides after teleporting behind him. Bakugo responded by redoubling his assault, attacking primarily with his right hand. At one point, Izuku realized too late that Bakugo had collected sweat in his left hand and then released an explosion similar in intensity to what his gauntlets could produce. The blast hit Izuku and singed his training uniform. He healed the burns and fought through the shock. Bakugo registered what he had done but pushed past his hesitation in his drive to win. Izuku's fear ebbed and anger grew. He launched himself at Bakugo with fierce determination and managed to shove his opponent into place while moving past him. Two metal wings unfolded from Izuku's back and he used them to strike Bakugo's head with a hard, reverberating impact that echoed through the stadium. The force rendered Bakugo stunned and unsteady. An official called that he was unconscious and declared Izuku Aizawa the winner, the voice lined with concern. Izuku stared at his fallen opponent and then at the stands. Gasps and shocked faces surrounded him. He began to hyperventilate and teleported to the commentator's box. He grabbed Mina Ishido and held her tightly as the announcer declared they would return soon for the awards ceremony. His father hurried to his side and urged him to focus on Mina. Izuku tried, but images of Bakugo's dazed form kept intruding. Overwhelmed, he began to cry and pushed Mina aside, clinging to his father and the commentator, who spoke calmly to soothe him. He held them both for a long time before finally letting go. His father smiled gently and reminded him they needed to proceed with the presentation. Izuku stood and said he would get a hoodie, then teleported to his dorm to change. He lowered the bottom of his mask beneath his goggles, pulled on a hoodie, and returned to the field at the intercom's request for the winners to step forward. He walked slowly to the center of the field with his head down, followed by Bakugo and Tokoyami. Bakugo's face was covered in bandages, but he stood with them. They were lifted onto concrete platforms for the ceremony. The announcer congratulated the winners of the first-year sports festival, and Uncle Toshinori stepped into the stadium to present the medals. Izuku received his medal after Tokoyami and Bakugo. Uncle Toshinori could see Izuku's sadness through his mask and offered warm encouragement, praising his tremendous effort. Izuku swallowed hard, uncertain whether the crowd's subdued reaction was support or unease. The announcer closed the festival and called for a round of applause for all the first-year students. The crowd rose in support of the other participants, while many still seemed unsettled by Izuku's performance. Izuku returned to his dorm after a short teleport to fetch Ashi, stripped into his pajamas, locked the door, and turned on a streaming service. He put on Lilo and Stitch and tried to fall asleep, but the movie only made him cry again. Sunday night, Bakugo wondered why Izuku would not come out. In the common area, he complained that the nerd would not show himself. Classmates tossed guesses around about who had looked worse after the sports festival and whether Izuku might be hiding. Bakugo grumbled and charged upstairs to Deku's door. He knocked softly and pressed his head to the wood, telling Izuku that he wanted him to come out because he was worried and that he would protect him from anyone who attacked or insulted him. A light sniffle answered, then Bakugo felt a hand on his shoulder. In an instant he was in Izuku's room and saw Izuku clinging to his side. Bakugo put a hand on Izuku's back and returned the hug. Izuku, tearful and stuttering, protested that he had thought he had killed Bakugo. Bakugo told him he could not be killed so easily. Izuku laughed through tears and buried his face in Bakugo's chest, apologizing quietly. Bakugo reassured him that he had asked for a fight and gotten more than he expected, and he told Izuku to call him Deku. Bakugo lifted Izuku's goggles and noted the dark circles under his eyes. He asked when Izuku had last slept. Izuku managed a shrug while stifling tears. Since Izuku was already in pajamas, Bakugo set him up in bed and prepared to stay the night so that Izuku would not go back to the movies he had been using to avoid sleep. Izuku blushed and buried his face in the pillow. Bakugo settled beside him and fell asleep. In the class chat, Bakugo told everyone that he had talked to Izuku and that Izuku had not slept, so Bakugo would stay with him for the night. Classmates expressed concern and a few teased, but others urged everyone to get some sleep because of school the next day. Bakugo found Izuku's phone on the desk, looked up a contact that seemed to be a parent, and messaged to ask if someone could make sure Izuku woke up for school. The reply asked Bakugo to check on him in the morning. Bakugo agreed and put his phone away before drifting off beside Izuku. The next morning, Bakugo woke to Izuku shifting beside him. Izuku looked confused, said he would go change, and teleported away. Bakugo dressed and grabbed his bag, moving through the dorm to find a few classmates in the hall. When Icy Hot asked if Izuku was okay, Bakugo said that Izuku was fine around him and that he would walk him to school. He arrived at Izuku's door to find Izuku standing awkwardly in goggles. Bakugo demanded that Izuku take them off. Izuku hesitated briefly, then offered a finger to initiate teleportation. Bakugo took it and they vanished. They reappeared in the staff room, where Ms. Deimnerix noticed Bakugo and questioned what he was doing there. Bakugo looked awkward and led Izuku to an empty classroom. He asked if Izuku was all right mentally. Izuku admitted that the problem was not physical recovery this time but how the others had seen his scars and learned that he had multiple quirks. He worried that people would never let him become a hero. Bakugo rolled his eyes and scrolled through his phone until he found videos of the sports festival and clips of excited commentators and classmates. He showed Izuku a clip of a pink-haired kid enthusiastically praising the competitors and pointing out how impressive it was that someone had multiple quirks and still performed so well. The enthusiasm in the clip and the other positive reactions made Izuku cry with relief and happiness. Bakugo smirked and held him while Izuku hugged him back. At that moment, Brainfuck entered the room and requested that the two separate, saying he would rather not witness any overly romantic display on his first day. Izuku blushed and let go. Bakugo sat and watched as the rest of the class arrived, relieved that Izuku seemed lighter than before. Mr. Eyebags arrived shortly after. The teacher stood at the front of the classroom, breathed in, and opened his eyes. He announced that there was a new student, Hitoshi Shinso, and asked the class to save questions for later because they had other matters to attend to. He turned on the projector and explained the number of agencies willing to take them. A bar chart appeared showing that the narrator, Deku, and Icy Hot had received the most offers. He handed out lists and told everyone to decide before the end of the day, then reminded the class they would be choosing hero names and urged them to think carefully. Eyebags looked down as if remembering something. Ms. Deimnerix entered and instructed the students to take a whiteboard and write their ideas. She would approve the names. The class hesitated until the girl with the frog-like quirk went up and presented her choice. Froppy, the rain season hero, which Ms. Deimnerix found endearing. The narrator went up next and initially wrote a ridiculous name as a joke. Ms. Deimnerix reacted with dismay and asked for a serious suggestion. Izuku had written an alternative, and the narrator quickly replaced the big joke with Ground Zero. Classmates complimented the change and Ms. Deimnerix approved before sending him back to his seat. The rest of the class, except Deku, offered their attempts while Deku held his whiteboard close. The teacher called Izuku up. He sighed, walked to the front, and presented his name, Kizuato. The teacher remarked that it was a bit edgy but comparable to Eraserhead and nodded approval. Izuku returned with a small smile. With every student having a name, the PRD was dismissed and the class was free for the rest of the time. The narrator talked with Deku and Icy Hot until Rockhead arrived. Later, Izuku's perspective continued. His father asked if everyone had selected their agency and most of the class answered affirmatively. Izuku had barely managed to review the options and wondered why 5,500 agencies wanted him. His father produced another sheet and mentioned he had forgotten to give Izuku the list of freelance heroes. Izuku groaned and banged his head on his desk. He flipped through the list and noticed one freelance name that stood out, Hawks. Izuku reviewed the rest but decided that the third option was the best for him. He highlighted the name and teleported the book to his father's desk before rubbing his forehead. His father then handed out addresses for the placements they would visit over the next 2 weeks and told everyone to go to the dorms and pack. Izuku received no address. His sheet simply said that he would see the person. His father shrugged, and Izuku chuckled, thinking he was probably in for something unexpected. He teleported to his dorm room, tossed some clothes into a bag, and left his hero costume beside them. He took off his goggles, changed into pajamas, and planned to go to bed early. As soon as he lay down, Bakugo called and told him that the group was having a movie night and wanted him to come down. Izuku asked to be carried. Bakugo reminded him he could teleport. Izuku teleported beside him and pretended to be tired, drawing a playful glare from Bakugo. The kitchen was full of classmates. Ashido teased that Bakugo seemed to think Izuku liked Uraraka, and Bakugo shouted at Uraraka, who replied that she was getting Oreos. Izuku teleported back to the dorms, put his eraser goggles back on, grabbed a blanket, and settled on the couch. Kirishima greeted him warmly, and Izuku returned the greeting. He had avoided them at lunch to avoid explaining his additional quirks. The class gathered around the TV and debated movies. Ida suggested letting Shinso pick since he was the newest member of Class 1A. Shinso declined, saying he did not think he would like the movies the group preferred. Kirishima wondered if Shinso thought they were not manly enough, and Kaminari said he could watch anything. The class agreed except for Izuku. Shinso sighed, grabbed the remote, and selected a film Izuku's father had recommended, a movie that had moved his father to tears the night they rescued Izuku. Izuku stood up and announced he would sit this one out. Kaminari tried to persuade him to stay, and someone asked Shinso to record Izuku's reaction, joking that Mr. Aizawa appreciated good storytelling. Izuku chuckled and teleported back to his room to practice capture training. He took a cloth and went to the green area around the dorms to work on the exercises his father had taught him, focusing on controlling his quirks. He could maintain control for about 2 minutes while moving the cloth and continued the drills for an hour or two until he had a usable video. When he returned, Denki sat on the floor beside Uraraka, visibly upset about a sad scene in the movie where a character was lost. Kaminari was sniffling and being comforted by classmates. Izuku asked if Kaminari was all right, and Kaminari admitted that Izuku had been right about the film. Izuku reassured him, saying his father had reacted the same way. The class quietly chuckled. Uraraka then asked why Bakugo called Izuku Deku, and why Izuku used the nickname Kakin for Bakugo. Izuku looked down awkwardly and explained that Kakin had been his childhood best friend when they were 4 years old. He added that he did not know where Deku came from, but it felt strange when Bakugo used his given name, Izuku, or when anyone called him by their teacher's name, Aizawa. Uraraka laughed that she had not thought Bakugo had friends. Bakugo stood up to swat at her and Izuku made him sit back down, earning a grumble. Kirishima then asked Aizawa what his quirks were. Izuku sighed and explained that everyone already knew about his regeneration and teleportation. He added that one of his other quirks allowed him to influence people within his line of sight and the other gave him the wings they had seen. Kirishima exclaimed that it was so cool and suggested that might be why Bakugo hadn't fought back. Izuku admitted he was more confident with teleportation than with the wings. Jiro asked how he had retrieved the ball after teleporting it to the moon, and Izuku clarified that he could teleport things without touching them as long as he had teleported them before. Yaoyorozu wondered if, theoretically, he could teleport Bakugo to someone else. Bakugo warned them not to try, and because he looked genuinely intimidating, Izuku teleported Todoroki to sit beside him instead. When Todoroki landed, he smiled, and Izuku teased him about what he wanted for Christmas. Todoroki replied that he fancied a slice of green cake, and Izuku blushed before returning him to his seat. Kirishima compared Izuku's quirk to one of Red Riot's allies, and Jiro asked if Tella was the name. Izuku said the quirks seemed similar but he had not watched much footage of the first-generation heroes. Shiro commented that it was a shame most of that content was missing. Kaminari picked up the remote and asked what movie they should watch. After a few random choices they settled on some films and later decided to play games. Ashido suggested Truth or Dare, and several classmates agreed. Izuku tried to stand to leave, but Todoroki gently tugged at his pajamas and pointed to the spot beside him, so Izuku went to sit down. The game started slowly. Kirishima asked if Aizawa wanted Truth or Dare. Izuku chose Truth. Kirishima asked whether Izuku liked boys, girls, both, or neither. Izuku admitted he had not thought about it much but thought he liked boys, and that he might like Bakugo and Todoroki. The class reacted and Ishido began joking about who would look cute together. Izuku asked Ishido truth or dare. She chose truth and said she felt attracted to many people and identified as pansexual. The game continued until it was Todoroki's turn. Todoroki asked Izuku truth or dare. Izuku chose dare. Todoroki suggested a playful challenge and the group laughed and went along with some silly tasks. Kaminari overexerted himself during one dare and short-circuited. Everyone laughed as he staggered around looking embarrassed. After a few rounds, Kirishima's shirt was torn from using his quirk, Yaoyorozu had fashioned a large prop for fun, Mina borrowed Tsuru's jacket, Sato was busy baking a cake, and Dark Shadow was being petted by Jiro. Ojiro dared Izuku to sit beside Todoroki, and Izuku complied, trying to hide his blush. As the evening went on, Izuku realized more clearly that he had feelings for both Todoroki and Bakugo. He made himself comfortable beside Todoroki and, after a few more rounds, fell asleep. Later he woke to find Todoroki carrying him toward his room. Startled, Izuku asked what was happening. Todoroki explained that Izuku had fallen asleep and he was bringing him to his room. Bakugo was there as well, and when Izuku asked why Bakugo had come, they said they had wanted to talk once he woke up. They all sat awkwardly in Izuku's room. Izuku asked what they wanted to discuss. Todoroki calmly told him that both he and Bakugo liked Izuku and wanted to know if Izuku would consider dating them. Izuku sat in shock, wondering why they would feel that way. Todoroki's presence had always been calming and familiar, and Izuku always felt safe around Bakugo. Bakugo muttered that there was no need to be so blunt. When Izuku lowered his goggles he realized he had been crying and asked why they wanted him. Bakugo and Todoroki pulled him into a long, comforting hug. They reassured Izuku that they had thought about it and that they cared for him, and they admitted that seeing him hide under his goggles made them sad. Izuku told them he loved them both and hugged them back. Their embrace felt reassuring and safe. They smiled and Bakugo ruffled Izuku's hair. Izuku rested his forehead against Todoroki's chest while Bakugo settled nearby, and the three of them ended up close together on the bed. Izuku smiled at the warmth of being cared for. He felt arms around him and both of them told him they loved him. He replied that he loved them too. When Izuku woke the next morning still close to them, he went to splash water on his face in the bathroom to clear his head. Returning to the room, he found Bakugo stirring and reaching as if to find him. Izuku returned to their side and curled against Bakugo's chest. Bakugo blinked, looked between Izuku and Todoroki, and asked if they had actually asked Izuku out or if it had been a dream. Izuku explained that Todoroki had asked him out while Bakugo had been awkward, but that both of them wanted to be together with him. Chapter end. He smiled up at the narrator and then looked at Todoroki, poking him and telling him to stop faking sleep. Todoroki yawned and stood up. The group prepared to go downstairs to eat when an oddly familiar voice from the open window teased that the narrator needed his carbs. They all turned to see Hawks sitting in the window with a chicken leg. The narrator blinked a few times and teleported the other two away. Hawks teased that the narrator had found himself some boyfriends, handed over a piece of paper, and asked the narrator to teleport a suitcase to the address on it. The narrator complied, then Hawks instructed him to put on his hero suit and mentioned that the narrator's father had put wing holes in the back. The narrator bowed, grabbed the costume, and teleported to the bathroom. He retrieved his capture weapon from the bathroom and dressed, then returned to his room to pull on his goggles. Hawks pointed toward the green area around the dorms and directed them to go there. He dropped out the window and the narrator teleported to his side, excited. Hawks asked for wings, and the narrator unfurled them. Hawks explained that this was a trial by fire and told him to follow, taking off immediately. The narrator awkwardly rubbed his elbow, then focused on the wings as his body lifted from the ground. He leaned forward, picked up speed, and reached a plateau before Hawks shouted for him to slow down. The narrator teleported to Hawks' side and managed to stay beside him. They wove between buildings until they heard an explosion. The narrator asked whether they should help, and Hawks reminded him that because he could not attack villains without a license, he needed to focus on rescuing any victims. They dove toward the bank and landed at the police line to assess the situation. A villain with a gun-like quirk was holding dozens of people hostage inside. Hawks asked if the narrator could teleport in and evacuate the hostages. The narrator said he could extract them all at once if he timed it right. Hawks encouraged him, and the narrator disappeared into the bank. Hiding behind a counter, the narrator waited for the villain to move forward. The villain advanced with a young boy as leverage and demanded a plane out of the country and a large sum of money. The narrator ignored the demand and deployed his capture weapon, sending it skittering across the floor to touch each person gently. Once everyone was accounted for except the young boy, the narrator teleported them to a makeshift medical station, then returned to Hawk's side and informed the chief negotiator that the only person left inside was the boy. The negotiator commended the narrator for his stealthy work. Hawks and the narrator debated options. The narrator suggested a non-confrontational way to get the villain to surrender, and Hawks reminded him that he could not use his quirk against villains without a license. The villain grew impatient and threatened the boy, preparing his weapon when Snipe appeared at their side. Snipe praised the narrator's work, fired a tranquilizer dart, and rendered the villain unconscious. Hawks praised the team and urged them to leave before reporters arrived. They took off, Hawks arranging for them to patrol near his home afterward. They flew toward the noisier part of town where the Hero Cafe stood and climbed to the top of a building to prepare. Hawks explained that patrols were mostly about presence and making a good impression. The narrator secured his lower mask and asked about how his teleportation sometimes carried momentum and other times did not. He mumbled that it came naturally and briefly wondered whether he should be able to teleport Hawks out of dangerous spots on command, which made Hawks go momentarily pale. Hawks told him to calm down and to get onto the street to start their patrol. When Hawks reached out to tap him, the narrator teleported to avoid the contact, then placed his hand on Hawks' shoulder. Hawks smiled and took the narrator's hand. They teleported down to the street together. Crowds swarmed Hawks for autographs, and he obliged with good humor. When the crowd pressed in too tightly, the narrator teleported up into the sky and extended his wings, hovering and waiting for someone to notice. Hawks did not catch on right away, and the narrator kept watch until the mob dispersed about an hour later. Hawks explained that this happened sometimes and that being third-ranked helped. People loved him. Then Hawks clicked his earpiece and shifted into speed mode, reporting that firefighters could not reach a fire on the other side of town and asking them to respond. They arrived at 3 apartment buildings on fire that looked strangely familiar. Hawks assigned the narrator to buildings 1 and 2 while he took building 3. The narrator teleported to the top of the first building and listened for voices. He heard a little girl shouting, rushed to the source, freed her from beneath a table, and teleported her to safety on the ground. He moved through rooms quickly, evacuating residents as he went. One apartment remained intact amid the damage, but he kept sweeping the building until Hawks radioed that building 3 was clear and water heroes moved in. The fire was under control about 10 minutes later. Residents from the second building began to emerge, many praising Hawks' quirk. Hawks asked whether the narrator had cleared his assigned building, and the narrator reported that one apartment was undamaged and that he found that odd. Hawks looked over, then asked to be taken to the preserved room. The narrator teleported Hawks to that room. Hawks looked disappointed. At that moment, the narrator heard a woman cry out for help. I ran down the hall and saw a child burst through the door while doing an all-might impression. The child announced his arrival proudly. Hawks asked what the child was doing. I turned toward his voice and told him to look. The woman and child were there. When I looked in Hawks' direction there was nothing, no body, no Hawks. I called his name and he answered from nearby. He grabbed my shoulder and the apartment shifted into a burned state. Hawks checked if I was okay. I asked him to look around for pictures. He shrugged and began searching. I moved slowly through the oddly empty apartment until I reached an electric fireplace with a large mantle. I picked up the first picture frame I could find and saw a green-haired boy and a woman. The boy looked identical to the picture Kaken had shown me. Tears came as I realized where I was. This must have been my old house and that woman must have been my mother. Hawks asked if I was all right. I dropped the frame and clung to him. He awkwardly patted my back, glanced at the mantle, and said we would go to his place and patrol tomorrow. He went to leave but I held him still. He used his wings to pull away gently, told me to pick up the least damaged pictures and head home, then smiled, patted my back again, and jumped out through one of the broken windows. I grabbed all the pictures I could and teleported to Hawk's side. He was about to be swarmed by onlookers, but I moved us before that happened. Hawks complained that he needed to keep appearances up, and I reminded him that he had said we were going to his house. I looked down at the haul of pictures I was holding and noticed how many of them showed people wearing All Might merchandise. Eventually I found one with myself, Kakin, my mother, and another woman who resembled Kakin. A flashback began to wash over me. In the memory, Kakin and I sat in the living room at about 3 years old. I asked why he had hit our mother, and he insisted she had been mean. A blonde woman scolded him for provoking me. Kakin shouted back and then crossed the room to hug me, telling me he would never hurt me. Hawks shook my shoulder and brought me out of the daze, asking how I was doing. I nodded and summoned my wings. He suggested we get some fried chicken first and led the way to the nearest KFC. I followed quickly to his side, trying to keep my emotions steady. We ordered, went to Hawk's place, ate, watched a movie, slept, and prepared for training the next day. I woke up in an awkward position and teleported to my feet. Where I had been sleeping, Hawks lay tangled up with himself and, until I teleported, probably tangled up with me. I went to his kitchen and started making pancakes. I wore a random pair of pajamas that definitely did not belong to me. Mine had cats on them, these had chicken wings. I grabbed eggs, flour, and milk and mixed them in a bowl until I felt Hawk's presence. Hawks yawned and greeted me good morning as he sat down. I poured batter into a frying pan and flipped pancakes while humming. Hawks remarked with surprise that I could cook and joked that he did not expect Aizawa to teach me that. I asked whether all pros were bad cooks or if it was just a coincidence that the ones I had met seemed to be. Hawks said it was the former while taking a bite. I set out 3 more pancakes for us. We ate and chatted until Hawks received a notification and mentioned he had a meeting with the Hero Commission. He told me I could wait on a nearby building and called from the bathroom for me to get dressed. I cleaned the kitchen and changed into my hero costume. Back in the kitchen, Hawks told me that we would be taking the bullet train and would likely be swarmed by fans. I muttered that I was not awake enough to argue and we flew out the window. We dropped to the train station and bought tickets. Before Hawks was recognized and approached, a few people pressed me with questions about my multiple quirks, how I had beaten Endeavor's child, and where my scars had come from. I pulled my goggles down and put my mask on underneath. The questions continued as I made my way back to Hawks. He smiled, apologized to the crowd, and said he had a meeting. He placed a feather on my fingers and teleported us into the emptiest car of the bullet train. Hawks sighed about how invasive fans could be, and I reminded him that I was the one with multiple quirks and a face full of scars. I sat beside him and fiddled with my capture weapon, wrapping it around the rail and using it like a hammock. Hawks laughed while scrolling his phone and joked that he would show Eraser a picture but that Eraser would never get anything done. I asked how long the trip to Hosu would take and Hawks answered about an hour. I asked if I could take a nap, and he agreed, promising to wake me when we arrived. I curled up in my makeshift hammock and fell asleep. Hawks woke me and told me we were at the next stop. He said the president had arranged for a longer meeting that day, and recited the rough plan: meeting, food, flight training, then night patrol. I readjusted my capture weapon and waited the few minutes until we arrived at Hosu Station. Hawks was immediately swarmed the moment someone recognized him. He was the most popular hero right now. He apologized to the crowd, said he had a meeting, and waved them off before he and I headed toward our assignment. I teleported Hawks to my side, and we flew toward the PHSA building. Hawks told me he would see me at 2 and slipped through an open window. I dropped onto a nearby low roof and lay down to rest, but I could not sleep. A disturbance in the air pulled at my attention. I listened and heard the faint thud of boots striking flesh. I spread my wings and scanned the area. 2 children were kicking a younger boy on the ground. One of the attackers mocked that the boy should give up and that his appearance would stop him from becoming a hero. The other taunted that his quirk was useless and prepared to kick again. I teleported to the edge of the roof above them, letting my wings drape and cast shadows over the trio. The 2 older children flinched and tapped each other in alarm. I dropped down to their level and gave them a disappointed look. I pulled down my goggles and told them that being a hero was not about looks and that they needed to change their attitude before telling others what they could be. I pushed past them and went to the crying child, told the bullies to leave, and they scrambled away. The boy sat huddled, bruised and shaken, with a wound at his side that left him pale and weak. I checked on him and moved to lift him, then froze when he suddenly rubbed his eyes and sprang out of my hands as if nothing were wrong. He smiled and thanked me, but the smile did not hide how tightly he was holding himself together. I asked if he wanted to talk, since his classmates had been mean. He said no at first and tried to slip past me, but his hair fell aside to show a V-shaped scar near one eye and tears beginning to form. I watched as he started to cry openly. I pulled him into a comforting hug as he sobbed, letting him know he was safe. After a few minutes he apologized for bothering me and tried to pull away. I told him to stay and talk, and he returned awkwardly and sat down. I suggested we move somewhere quieter. He agreed, and I took his hand and teleported us to a nearby rooftop with a better view. We sat cross-legged facing each other. I asked about his quirk, and he admitted he thought it was useless. He explained that his quirk allowed him to grow flora around him. I told him that sounded incredible and started imagining possibilities, and he blushed but smiled at the praise. He tugged on my belt and reminded me I had been talking for 10 minutes. I apologized and then asked if I could check his chest for injuries. He hesitated, then shyly raised his shirt. His chest was clean. When I briefly lifted the top half of my costume to check myself, a long scar along my side showed in the same place the boy had injured. I put my costume back on and told him he could turn around. He brightened, made a small white rose grow from a sprout of flora, plucked it, and handed it to me. He thanked me for talking with him. I brushed his hair aside and told him that scars didn't define him, they were just part of his story and might even intimidate villains. He hugged my side, drying his tears. I asked where he lived, and he told me he stayed at Sunny's orphanage. I teleported both of us to the building and watched him walk inside, clearly still afraid. I put my goggles and mask back on and waited 10 minutes before knocking. A young woman with brown hair answered. I explained that I was a hero student from UA and that I had found one of the children being bullied. She asked if the child had a V-shaped scar. I confirmed and said I had not asked his name. She told me his name was Akira and that she had encouraged him to report bullying to the principal, but he would not talk about it. I assured her the specific 2 kids I had seen would not be bothering him again. She thanked me, and I introduced myself as Kazato. Endeavor's agency loomed next. Endeavor smirked and told Todoroki that he had finally come around from his rebellious phase and intended to work by his side, using his fire. He stood and placed a hand on Todoroki's shoulder. Todoroki made it clear that he was not there to be someone's creation. He was there because Endeavor was the number 2 hero and Todoroki had not received an offer from All Might. Endeavor scowled, pushed past him, and announced that they would go on patrol in Hosu to try to catch the hero killer. He urged Todoroki to hurry. Todoroki rose, already in his costume, and followed. Endeavor barked orders to the sidekicks. They made their way to the roof, climbed into a waiting helicopter, and the blades began to turn as they prepared to depart. We headed to Hosu City just before 4 p.m. We moved slowly through the streets, checking every alley and finding nothing. The narrator wondered if anyone could expect to find one of the most elusive villains in broad daylight. Endeavor rounded a corner when an explosion erupted near the bullet train. The narrator asked one of Endeavor's sidekicks what had happened. She said she did not know and guessed it was probably a villain. Another explosion rocked the plaza. Endeavor ordered Burnin to go to the train with the others and told the narrator that he would take Shoto to the plaza. We started running toward the second blast when the sound of Ida's engines reached us. The narrator demanded that reinforcements be sent their way and then ran toward the noise. The hero killer stood over Ida, who lay immobilized with a pro slumped against a wall. Ida muttered to himself, barely audible. As the hero killer prepared to strike, the narrator unleashed a barrage of flames. The killer was surprised but quickly recovered, taunting the narrator as if mocking a child playing at heroism. The narrator responded that they were not playing and fired a wall of ice to block his view. The hero killer laughed and warned against blocking the view of a faster opponent. The narrator felt that voice come from behind, even though the man was in front. Suddenly a sharp pain seared the narrator's right arm and their body began to falter. The hero killer approached Ida, preparing to move again. The narrator shouted for him to stop and reminded him that Ida had a good friend. The hero killer was interrupted when a metal wing struck him in the head. The narrator found themselves beside Aizawa. Aizawa made it clear that he would not allow harm to come to his friends. The hero killer sneered and called Aizawa a project of Shigaraki. Aizawa rejected the accusation and threatened to incapacitate him if he did not surrender. The hero killer said he would enjoy ending Aizawa's life and charged, blades flashing. Aizawa grabbed the narrator's costume and pulled them to a windowsill. Ida shouted that this was not their fight and that they should stay back. Stain mocked their nobility and turned away. Aizawa propped the narrator against the window and leaped after Stain. The hero killer offered the narrator a chance to leave, insisting they deserved to live, but Aizawa refused to give up on Ida and prepared his capture weapon. Stain ignored him and lifted his sword over Ida again. Aizawa's movements grew erratic as his control kicked in and his hair rose with the strain. The hero killer snarled, fighting Aizawa's influence. Aizawa's control faltered, and Stain managed to throw a knife that struck Izuku's arm. Aizawa quickly stabilized the wound, and Stain ran past him, grabbing the thrown blade. Aizawa collapsed to the floor just as the narrator began to move again. The narrator dropped to the street and fired ice at Stain. The hero killer dismissed them as a nuisance and leaped to avoid the attack, announcing his intent to kill them all. He produced 4 knives and hurled them at once. The narrator braced to block and felt someone else step in front of them. Aizawa, using his capture weapon and wings, intercepted the knives, holding Stain in place long enough for the narrator and Ida to charge at full capacity. Ida kicked Stain while the narrator burned his midsection, severely weakening him. The injured pro managed to pull himself up and, coughing, produced a rope from his pocket. He suggested they wait for backup and then bound Stain, setting him down on the sidewalk by the road. Aizawa admonished Ida not to be reckless. Ida apologized for acting impulsively. The narrator urged concern for the other heroes, noting that the Nomu might have appeared. Aizawa removed his goggles and blinked away tears, worried about the danger to everyone. From above, Hawks reported that Endeavor had dealt with most of the Nomu and that the final one had flown off, meaning they could focus on the hero killer. A sudden scream from the sky forced everyone to cover their ears. A Nomu dove at them and latched onto Aizawa's shoulders. Aizawa began to flail, shouting that he could not move, and the group froze in alarm. The hero killer rose and charged at the Nomu, throwing blades at its legs and wings and bringing it down before collapsing unconscious himself. The narrator ran to Aizawa, who was exhausted and had tears in his eyes. The narrator removed 2 pads connected to Aizawa's costume that bore the league symbol and then pulled him into a supportive hug. Aizawa murmured that he was tired and would wake up soon. Later, Izuku regained consciousness in a hospital room. He felt a bright light on his face and heard muffled voices. When he tried to shift, he realized his hands and feet were restrained. He scanned the room and, disoriented, tried to remember how he had been captured after the encounter with Stain and the Nomu. He attempted to teleport and found that it still worked. As his vision cleared, he saw his father at the foot of the bed and a dog-shaped officer in a police uniform. His father told Izuku to sit back down on the bed. The dog-shaped officer explained that the USJ attack had been a tragedy and that its circumstances seemed suspicious. Villains had appeared where they had known the students would be. The officer said that only Class 1A had known the students' presence at the USJ, suggesting the possibility of a traitor among them. Izuku realized with shock that they suspected he had informed the League about the students' whereabouts. Aizawa's POV. Mandalay reported that villains were attacking. Aizawa instructed Vlad to protect the students as he ran out of the remedial classroom. If villains were here, his students were in danger. At least Izuku should be okay, he thought. A wave of blue flames rushed toward him as he cleared the doorway. He dodged and climbed to the top of an awning. Dabi taunted him and launched another flurry of blue fire while apologizing that he was using his flames in case anyone was watching. Aizawa narrowed his eyes and activated his quirk, suspecting the man might be manipulating perceptions. Dabi disclosed that someone was not safe and that his caregivers worked for the League. Aizawa asked who Dabi meant while throwing his capture weapon. Dabi affirmed that it was Izuku and that Izuku was being hurt and needed help. Aizawa checked the figure to confirm it was real. He used his binding cloth to secure the person and rendered him unconscious with a quick, non-lethal strike. He regretted not having rested earlier. Later, about a day after the fighting had ended, Aizawa found himself stuck in a meeting about the protests outside UA. He could not stop thinking about Izuku. Power Loader told Aizawa that they could at least clear his child's name. Aizawa, surprised since he had been half-focused on the meeting, listened as Power Loader explained that Izuku could not have told the villains anything because he had been under isolation. Aizawa tensed. Told the room that he had information regarding Izuku. Zashi asked Aizawa to explain. Aizawa reported that when he had confronted Dabi, the villain had said that Izuku was in danger and that his caretakers were working for the League. The room fell into stunned silence before Zashi angrily demanded to know where those League villains were who had hurt his child. Nizu assigned Aizawa and Zashi to go handle the situation while the rest dealt with the protests. Aizawa and Zashi stood and left immediately. They both anticipated the barrage of reporters outside the building but cared only about getting to Izuku. Aizawa looped his capture weapon around his neck as they walked through the crowd. Reporters and bystanders shouted accusations and questions, demanding comments and blaming him for his student's capture. Aizawa did not respond. He needed to get Izuku back. They drove to the local HPSC holding offices, where lower-level villains and detainees were kept. They arrived quickly, driven by Zashi's anger. Inside, a woman with pale hair typed at a computer. When Aizawa asked where Izuku Aizawa was, she said that he was under isolation and that she could not disclose his location. Aizawa already suspected he was being held in the lower level of the facility, in a section designed for teleporters. He pulled Zashi toward the elevator and used his license to bypass the ID check for the basement. The elevator took them down to the lowest layer. They walked past observation windows until they reached the end of the corridor. Through the glass, Aizawa saw two guards restraining Izuku while another administered an injection, and the guards laughed as Izuku cried out. One guard stepped out to hold the door for his partner. Aizawa reacted quickly, disabling the first guard with a precise, non-lethal strike and using his binding cloth to restrain the other. Zashi entered and struck the remaining guard, then scooped up Izuku and carried him out. Izuku clung to Zashi in obvious distress. The syringe they had used was labeled volcanic, which sounded like the name of a quirk. Aizawa examined it with concern. Izuku's POV. Izuku thought that he liked the way this man smelled. The scent reminded him of Papa. He worried that the men would come back. Pain flared through his arms and skin, a burning sensation he could not ignore. He could not remember how many modifications the captors had forced on him. Some of the quirks they had given him had left him with sensitive areas and a constant nagging pain in his head and lower spine. He used another ability to hide the visible changes, but the soreness remained. A bright light shone on his face. He felt a seat beneath him and cold air against his skin. The burning eased as he realized he was in a car. He looked forward and recognized his father in the passenger seat. Relief washed over him at the sight. His father moved toward him and asked if he was okay. Izuku nodded faintly. His father encouraged him to speak, but Izuku shook his head. He could not control one of the quirks the men had explained. It allowed him to change his voice's pitch, volume, and accent unpredictably. He feared he might unintentionally hurt his father's ears or frighten him with it. His father answered a call and quickly moved to the front seat to drive. Izuku felt disoriented, but being away from the captors helped him start to recover his sense of direction. He worried about Kaken and Shaken and how they would react to the changes he now carried. He thought he might have as many as 13 quirks in total, counting those he had before. The thought of what would happen if he were knocked unconscious and all those perspectives crowded his mind at once made him uneasy. Izuku woke up in his own bed and felt how good it was to sleep at home. Present Mike reassured him that they would be back at UA soon and that Izuku's father would join them later. Izuku listened as Present Mike summarized the chaos that had happened while he was gone. The final exams had been brutal, Katsuki and Shota had nearly died in an intense battle with Izuku's father. A training camp had taken place in the forest, the League had attacked and Katsuki had been kidnapped but was now safe, and the ranking of heroes had shifted after a major public revelation. Izuku felt responsible and wished he had been there to help. Present Mike asked if Izuku wanted to visit Bakugo. Izuku thought for a moment and then nodded. He still worried about how Katsuki and Shota would react to his quirks. He rose unsteadily and followed Present Mike to the car. Izuku's father was asleep after a late-night press conference. Izuku sat in the front seat and watched the neighborhood go by, bracing himself for the attention that wealth tended to attract. They pulled up outside a 3-story detached house with a tidy garden. Present Mike said that this was the address Shoyuta had given him. Izuku kept his hand in Present Mike's as they walked to the door. Present Mike knocked. Voices answered from inside, and a stressed-looking man opened the door and introduced himself as Katsuki's father and asked if anything was wrong. Present Mike explained that he had come to show that Izuku was okay. The man called into the house for Katsuki, and Katsuki's mother, Mitsuki, rushed out, astonished and relieved to see Izuku alive. Mitsuki hugged Izuku instinctively. Present Mike explained that Izuku did not like being touched, and Mitsuki protested that he had always been the clingy kind. The man and Mitsuki exchanged a look, and Present Mike offered to come in. Inside, Katsuki was sitting on the couch. He moved quickly to Izuku and hugged him tightly, smelling familiar and becoming for a moment the fierce kid Izuku remembered. Present Mike suggested that the two of them go to Katsuki's room to give the adults space to talk. Katsuki grunted and led the way. Izuku teleported them to the top of the stairs, and Katsuki finally released him. Katsuki asked if Izuku was okay and how things had been at the government facility. Izuku rubbed his neck and made a small pen gesture, then offered a written explanation that the League had infiltrated the facility. When Katsuki asked what they had done, Izuku pulled up his sleeve to show 7 injection marks on his arm. Katsuki asked to look closer and stormed into the bathroom in a sudden, furious outburst, slamming and yelling as he worked through the anger. After he calmed, Katsuki returned and suggested they cuddle. He picked Izuku up and laid him down on the bed, murmuring that Izuku should eat more because he felt so light. Present Mike sat with Katsuki's parents in the living room and explained Izuku's past. He had been kidnapped when he was 4 and had been mistreated for 8 years. His quirk prevented his scars from fading. Mitsuki and Masaru exchanged a pained look. Mitsuki asked whether Izuku and Katsuki were in a relationship. Present Mike replied that was for them to decide to share. He introduced himself properly as Hisashi Yamadazawa, also known as Present Mike, and noted their old friendship with Inko. Masaru offered to get tea. When Masaru left the room, Mitsuki asked why Katsuki had not told her sooner. Present Mike suggested that Katsuki was a stubborn teenager who might be embarrassed and hesitant to open up, but reminded her that the boys had once been close. Mitsuki, softening, confessed that Inko had been her best friend and that they had searched for Izuku for years before believing him dead. Seeing him alive and like Inko brought new emotion. Present Mike assured her that Izuku was in good hands and asked her to keep him safe. Mitsuki accepted the request with trembling gratitude. Later, at a faculty meeting, Aizawa and the other teachers discussed how to determine what Izuku's quirks did. Vlad emphasized that the meeting was about student safety, while Nizu argued that Izuku's safety was paramount and that testing might be necessary because the quirks could affect his health. Cementos suggested a blood test, and Aizawa countered that random searching without a clear target would not be productive. All Might stood and said he knew someone who could help. The Eye Expo was opening the next day, and he could take Izuku to David Shield, who had assisted with quirks before and likely had the equipment to test him properly. Nizu decided that they would follow that course, noting that many of Class 1A already had tickets to the expo, which made the logistics simpler. Aizawa asked where Izuku was. He learned that Izuku was with Katsuki and possibly Todoroki. Aizawa noted that Katsuki had not let Izuku out of his sight since they returned to the dorms. Katsuki had become noticeably clingy, and Izuku had grown quiet and withdrawn, spending most of his time with Aizawa, Katsuki, and Todoroki and even avoiding some classmates, which was causing concern. Back in Katsuki's room, Katsuki asked if Izuku knew what his quirks did. Izuku shook his head, still uncertain and searching for answers. He and Sho had been trying to find out what my new quirks did. Sho suddenly asked why my arms were smoking. I looked down to see a red liquid burning along my skin. Kaken put his hand on it and quickly pulled back in obvious pain. Sho offered to try, claiming he had better resistance, and Kaken shot back that Sho was no better than him at anything related to cold and heat. Sho touched my arm and rubbed his hand along it, observing that it looked and felt like molten lava. A skeletal man entered my dorm and announced that he was there. Kaken mumbled a greeting to All Might. Sho responded in a monotone hello. The man looked familiar, but I could not place him. He told me to prepare a bag for a few days because I was coming with him to see what those quirks were. I took the notebook in my lap and wrote a sentence asking who he was. He read it and identified himself as All Might, adding that I used to call him Uncle Toshi and asking if I remembered. I shook my head and looked down in shame. On the 12th day, they had done something to my hippocampus that interfered with my recognition. Smell was the only thing that still worked. Kaken shouted that he was not leaving me and grabbed me into a protective hug. Sho said he could bring Kaken along and mentioned that he had an invite to the expo. Kaken gave Uncle Toshi a death glare. Sho told me to go get ready while he and Kaken left the room, then told me to stay with All Might and that he loved me. Uncle Toshi advised that I bring my hero costume just in case. I nodded and grabbed the yellow bag in the corner of my room, quickly packing the least revealing clothes I had along with a notebook and pen. I picked up Ashi, my plush Pomeranian, as the last thing to put in the bag. Uncle Toshi asked if I was ready. Uncle Toshi took me to a car and we were driven to an airport. Toshi was polite, but I still had not had the chance to smell him, so I could not tell how he had been important to me before. My head began to ache as usual as we climbed to altitude. Toshi noticed my discomfort and asked if I was all right. When my ears popped, something behind me shifted and Toshi stared in surprise, nearly toppling from his seat. He exclaimed in astonishment and nearly fell out of his chair. I sat up when I felt something on my back. Toshi asked if this was one of my new quirks, suggesting a cat mutation. I shrugged and pointed at his phone on the table. He handed it to me with the camera already on. Atop my head lay two fluffy cat ears, green fading to black. I rubbed one between two fingers and cupped the other in my hand. I should have been freaking out, but considering how much worse it could have been, I felt oddly calm. I curled into a ball on the seat and fell asleep. Partway through a dream about Kaken eating snow cones, my whole body began to tremble with a pleasant sensation. I leaned into it and the dream changed to a crowded room full of people. There were about 13 of them, all different and all panicked except for 4. Aki recognized me joyfully and jumped into my arms. I smiled and gently set her back down. Contour, speaking over the shouting, asked me to help calm the group. One particularly irate man demanded where they were. Tella identified him as the most recent arrival and described him as very hot-headed. I realized that my voice quirk was not affecting me in that moment. I called for quiet, and the room fell silent. The hot-headed man ran over, grabbed my shirt, and shouted angrily about being trapped with no way out. He lunged and made violent threats. I used my control to stop him from continuing. I asked to explain the situation. Everyone stared when I turned to them and said I was sorry but that they were dead and that their quirks and consciences were now in my body. A scruffy-looking boy with 2 black cat ears shrugged and suggested they play poker. I blinked and found myself back on the private jet with Uncle Toshi shaking me. He said we had arrived. I looked out the window to see a huge floating circle with a city built upon it. Toshi explained that it was I-Island, a technological haven for support item inventors and scientists. I knew of I-Island. I had only lost my facial and audio recognition. The villains had tried to make me afraid of my friends by tampering with me. The plane landed and Toshi and I disembarked. An automated moving walkway carried us into a station and then out into a vast plaza, the central tower rising above us. People called out for Uncle Might as we approached the tower. A blonde woman on a pogo stick bounced toward us and launched herself, effortlessly catching Uncle Toshi. Toshi smiled and greeted her warmly. She introduced herself as Melissa Shield and spun him around in a friendly greeting. I hung back, uncomfortable with the noise and spectacle, but I was here to be helped. Melissa put Toshi down and acknowledged him before turning to me and asking if I was Izuku. Toshi said he had hoped her father could help. Melissa offered her hand and introduced herself properly. I tried to politely avoid a handshake while saying my name. Melissa announced that they would head to her father and that she would show me around the expo afterward. Toshi and I followed her through the bustling expo like two lost puppies. As we walked, Toshi explained more about I-Island and its purpose. I remembered Master mentioning I-Island and that it was supposed to be my first assignment to retrieve something until I had been taken away. Toshi described the island as a floating center of science and invention with heavy security, and he spoke fondly of his old sidekick, David Shield. Shield was the designer for all of All Might's hero costumes and many everyday devices. More importantly, he had managed to prolong Toshi's quirk for an extra year before Toshi met his apprentice Mirio and transferred it, and he was planning to figure out what each of the protagonists' quirks did. They arrived at the giant tower and took an elevator up. Melissa asked why Papa needed to help Izuku, and Toshi answered that it was personal. The narrator shifted awkwardly as the elevator doors opened. Melissa led them down a corridor and opened a door into a room where a man sat at a desk building something. The man looked up and asked if it was Sam. Toshi announced his presence by momentarily transforming into a giant. The man greeted All Might and said it had been a while. Toshi introduced the narrator as the boy he had mentioned. The man stood and introduced himself as David Shield and said he would help with the narrator's quirks. When asked what he had been working on, Shield explained that it was a hemiquarkial separator, far more accurate than the models used in a doctor's office. Shield asked Melissa to show All Might around the expo while they worked, and Melissa obliged, pulling Toshi out of the room. Shield motioned toward a bookshelf and said he would show the narrator to his lab. The narrator tilted their head at the bookshelf marked with a collection of hero mangas. Shield pulled on volume number 101, All Might, Origin, and the bookshelf split to reveal a dimly lit lab. The narrator hesitated, the lab felt too familiar. Shield flicked on the lights at the narrator's request, and the room revealed several strange tubes and a soft-looking bed in the center. Shield instructed the narrator to sit on the bed, and the narrator complied. Shield explained that he needed to take a considerable amount of blood and would put the narrator to sleep, then put on a mask and gloves and brought out a needle containing a yellow liquid. The narrator instantly teleported off the bed and unfurled wings, shouting that there would be no needles and forcing Shield to drop the syringe. Shield said he would get nitrous, and the narrator, stuttering, apologized before teleporting back onto the bed. Shield reassured the narrator and asked what their biological quirk was. The narrator admitted that they had been quirkless. Shield asked if that was why they had been taken, and the narrator gave a sad nod. Shield hummed for a moment, then placed a nitrous mask on the narrator's face. The narrator quickly drifted into a dream about Sho and cats. At Yue's underground interrogation room, Aizawa watched as Zashi demanded to know what the villains had done to his son. Dabi responded angrily, swearing and calling Aizawa a name while issuing a violent threat. Aizawa intervened calmly, used his quirk on Zashi to restrain him, and demanded that Dabi explain. Dabi said that he had known, at least in part, what was going to happen to Izuku. He explained that Shigaraki had sent him on a mission on the night of the meeting and that he only learned details because Toga could not keep quiet. Dabi said he had found the vials intended for Izuku and altered them. The original plan would have left Izuku nearly inert, so Dabi had gone to Shigaraki and proposed a different plan to create a personal Nomo for the raid on the camp. When Aizawa asked which Nomo Dabi meant, Dabi answered that no specific Nomu existed. Instead, he had gathered quirks that would not arouse Shigaraki's suspicion and that would have made a suitable Nomu, but he had given those quirks to Izuku instead. Aizawa said they would have Tsukachi verify the claims once he arrived, and he asked Dabi which quirks he had provided. Dabi listed what he could remember: a cat mutation, a transforming quirk, a thermal discharge ability, and a volcano-type quirk. He added that the volcano quirk had been one of Shigaraki's, and that it caused Izuku to sweat molten lava. Aizawa felt a surge of anger toward the League but noted that a plea could be arranged with Dabi. He told Dabi that he hated him for what had been done but thanked him for preventing greater pain for Izuku. Dabi replied that he had known Izuku before Aizawa had and that he cared about him at least as much. Aizawa said he needed rest and warned everyone to avoid escalating the situation. A male voice from the right informed me that I was finally awake and had been trying to figure out my quirks. I answered with a confused sound while trying to open my eyes. Light flooded my vision as I adjusted, and the man muttered that it was a video game reference. He added that I had been out for an hour and would feel lightheaded for a while but would be fine. I turned to see David Shield. I tried to recall what had happened before I blacked out. I had come to Island with Toshi, met a blonde man named David Shield, he had put a mask on my face, and now I was here. I asked about my quirks. Shield shifted the subject at first and asked to turn the lights off because my eyes had changed during my sleep. He flicked the lights and the room took on a green hue. He asked if I could see, and when I confirmed, he turned the lights back on and handed me a mirror. My pupils had narrowed into slits instead of their usual circular shape. David explained that, together with the ears and tail, it was strong evidence for a cat-type quirk. I looked again and saw 2 green and black ears on my head. He said that the separator was working hard on my other quirks and that Melissa and All Might were in the inventions hall. He would call Melissa when the decoding finished. He smiled and I sat up, readjusting to being awake. I thanked him, and he replied that any friend of All Might was a friend of his. I left Shield's office and found a map quickly. I tried to teleport but couldn't. Island had an anti-teleportation field to prevent villain attacks. I studied the map, found the building labeled Invention Pavilion, and decided to use my wings. The red-winged boy who had helped me control them earlier should make it easy to get there. I walked through the halls searching for an open window until I found a floor lined with wind turbines. From the stairs, I pushed through the door to the turbine area. I moved to the edge of the floor and leaped off the building. The wind in my hair was a relief after being cooped up for so long. I spotted the warehouse where Toshi and Melissa were likely working and dove toward it. I landed awkwardly in front of the building and, realizing I was out of practice, quickly mended a twisted ankle before heading into the dim interior. A round-cheeked girl called out my name from behind, surprised to see me. I asked if I knew her, and she identified herself as Uraraka, also known as Uravity, using a teasing nickname as she tried to jog my memory. A taller, ravenet-haired girl stepped forward and introduced herself as Momo Yaoyorozu, explaining calmly that Mr. Aizawa had informed them I had lost much of my personal recognition. The ravenet with earphone jacks coming from her earlobes pointed out my ears, tail, and eyes, and asked if I had noticed them. Uraraka began to respond but stopped when her eyes landed on my head. She squealed that it was so cute and leaped forward to pet my ears. I attempted to teleport to avoid their attention but could not. The 3 girls started rubbing my ears and I scratched their hands away. Uraraka and the ravenets hissed in surprise. I noticed thin, pale markings across their arms and apologized immediately. They stepped back and insisted it was their fault and that they should not have done that. Yaoyorozu offered an apology on their behalf. Toshi and Melissa arrived from behind me, and Melissa was not far off. All Might was there too. He explained that the expo party that night had been organized as his retirement event and he did not want to miss it. We composed ourselves and moved through the exposition until we reached a cafe to rest. As soon as we sat, a purple-haired boy and a yellow-haired boy approached serving as waiters. Jiro, the earlobe girl who had introduced herself earlier, asked what they were doing there. The yellow-haired boy, Kaminari, said he had taken a job to earn cash and see the expo, while the purple-haired boy, Hitoshi Shinso, said he had come because he did not trust Kaminari. Shinso mentioned that we were classmates, and he asked about my cat ears and whether he could pet them. I was about to refuse when a familiar scent hit me, caramel and mint, and then another scent that I associated with people I knew, Kaken and Sho. I realized my body was vibrating and then heard it shift into a purr. Looking up, I recognized Hitoshi. The memory of the sports festival came back and I recalled that his quirk involved brain-related effects. I asked him to confirm and he did. I explained that I smelled lavender, which brought the memory to mind, and that my cat quirk might be responsible for these sudden, inconsistent memories. Toshi suggested testing the effect on Kaminari. I moved toward the other waiter and sniffed his hand, catching the scent of ozone and confirming my recognition. I realized with relief that I was able to remember again. Melissa later told me that Papa wanted us to head up to his office because his machine had finished working. Ida reminded everyone that we were meeting at 6. I nodded, extended my wings, took Melissa's hand, and flew toward David Shield's office. I held myself outside the window until Shield noticed and opened it. Shield asked if I could not use the door. I admitted that the window had been quicker. Shield sighed and went to his computer, explaining that the file included my original quirks as well. Shield showed the quirks list for Izuku. Regan, the user can heal any wound. Drawback, scars on the user will fade. Teleport, the user can move themselves or objects anywhere in the world. Drawback, exhaustion can cause misteleportations. Control, the user can control a target's movements while the target is in view. Drawback, the user's eyes turn red, their hair stands on end, and both eyes and hair become irritated. Alloy wings, the user can produce carbon fiber wings from their back. Drawback, the user experiences back pain if the wings are not used often enough. Volcano, the user sweats molten lava and gains heat resistance. Drawback, the user's arms emit smoke. Thermal discharge, the user can absorb and discharge heat in various ways, such as explosions, flames, or lava, increasing combat power. Drawback, it can cause heat stroke. Solidification, the user can change liquids to solids. Drawback, it causes soreness in the user's forms. Nico, a cat mutation granting night vision, ears, and a tail. Drawback, cat-like behavior. Mirage, the user can alter their physical appearance. Drawback, any extra parts are not physical. Data touch, anything the user touches will transfer information to them. Drawback, the user's arm glows with blue technological markings when used. TIG, the user can fuse materials. Drawback, the user's eyes become sensitive while using it. Chameleon, the user can turn invisible. Drawback, the user cannot use other quirks while invisible. I scanned the list over and over. The quirks were incredibly powerful with only minor drawbacks. It didn't make sense that the League would give me this much strength. Master had never allowed me abilities like these on the off chance I might return home. It couldn't be the hero community, they did not have that ability. Shield asked one question, how my body was suited for so many quirks. I said I did not know and that it could be because I had been quirkless for a long time. Melissa reacted with surprise that I had once been quirkless, and I confirmed that I was not quirkless anymore. My phone then buzzed loudly in my pocket. Ida demanded to know where I was and insisted it was already 6. I nodded at Melissa toward the still open window. She stepped closer, offered her hand, and I took it. She guided me back out the window toward the meeting point with Ida. Melissa shouted that I needed to change. I asked where, and she pointed toward a large clock tower and told me to go to the school-like building there. I flew toward it, and Melissa directed me to the nearby dorms. We went inside and climbed to the top floor. Melissa opened her door and apologized for not having suits, then pulled out 2 long black garment bags that looked like slim body bags. She handed one to me, saying it should fit. I took it to the bathroom. Inside was a medium-length red dress and a few accessories. After I fought through the embarrassment, I changed into the dress. The straps were fiddly and the bow at the back felt unnecessary, but the open back would allow me to fly to the meetup point. Melissa knocked on the door to hurry me along, and I finished quickly. She opened the door, helped me up, and we headed out. I looked at Melissa and admitted that, although I cared deeply for Kaken and Sho, Melissa was very pretty in her own right. We moved quickly to the central tower, where Ida was visibly upset about my lateness until he saw my outfit and let it go. Kaminari complimented my appearance, drawing an icy stare. Todoroki guided me to his side and shielded me from further teasing. His quiet protectiveness made me blush. Yamamo asked where Bakugo and Kirishima were, but Ida insisted that lateness did not matter because they needed to leave immediately. Before anyone could act, metal panels snapped into place over the doors and windows and a siren began wailing. The dorm's security system announced that the island was under lockdown and told everyone to remain calm. It was clear something serious was happening. We all headed to the hall to see what had triggered the lockdown. Melissa suggested that someone check the glass floor above the ballroom where a glass viewing area allowed a view down into the main space. Everyone looked at me, making me nervous, and Melissa pointed to chameleon on my quirks list, indicating I should go invisible and scout. I thought about the first time I used my other quirks and imagined myself fading from sight. When my wings retracted, I knew I had successfully become invisible. I moved to the glass floor and peered down into the ballroom. My eyes widened when I saw heroes restrained and held down. Toshi was on the stage, also restrained. I crouched, became visible again, and signaled Jiro to come over. I pointed to her ear jacks and then at the floor to indicate using her equipment to listen or relay. She connected to the floor and, following a plan, I concentrated on generating controlled flashes with my body heat. The signal worked. Toshi began to communicate and Jiro followed his instructions before shaking her head with frustration. I stood, gave a determined look and ran back to the class. Using the connection they had established, the group confirmed that 5 villains were in the main room and that the boss had taken David's shield and his assistant to an upper layer. The students prepared to respond. Jiro explained that All Might had reported the villains were in control of the island and threatening the residents. Izuku insisted they had to go help. The others reacted with surprise, but Uraraka agreed that they should do something, and Sho added that Izuku was usually right. Shinso grumbled and agreed to go after being teased into it. Everyone else consented, and they prepared to move. With the group in agreement, they burst into the hallways and ran toward the next stairwell. Izuku rode up front with Ida and Uraraka while Sho guarded the flank. Melissa, panting, answered that the top was about 200 floors up. A collective sigh rose from the group as they reached the 15th floor. The next stretch was a long climb of identical stairwells and complaints. On the 66th floor, a metal trapdoor blocked their path. Melissa noted that the oxygen lab was on that floor and that a service elevator should be inside. Sho warned that the villains had probably seen them and they would have to fight soon. Izuku decided the elevator was their best option and they hurried through the lab corridors until they reached a solidly shut door. Shinso readied his capture weapon and suggested Izuku break it open. When no one moved, his teammates urged him on. Sho teased Izuku about his nervous mumbling. Izuku focused, redirected his heat to his muscles to increase their strength, and broke the door open with a single, powerful strike. Kaminari called for them to move to the elevator, and they ran to the center of the oxygen lab. A loud ding sounded from a control panel. A short time later, the final stretch came into view as Melissa sprinted ahead toward the control room. Plan A had failed and they had switched to Plan B. Only Izuku and Melissa remained uncaptured. Izuku followed closely until he heard voices from a side room and paused to look in. David's shield was talking to his assistant, and both men appeared relieved at recovering something valuable that could help All Might. From his hiding spot, Izuku saw a masked man enter and press a pistol toward the assistant. The assistant complied and handed over a briefcase. David's shield began to speak, but he was suddenly struck and went down. Melissa ran into the room and rushed to her father. The situation escalated when the masked villain put the pistol to Melissa's head. Izuku surged forward with a burst of speed and spread his wings to shield her. The villain fired and the wings took the impact, throwing off sparks and smoke but protecting Melissa. The masked attacker seized the briefcase, grabbed David's shield, and fled from the vault, quickly meeting up with an ally. A thick wall of steel manifested to trap Izuku. He strained against it, feeling trapped and desperate, until his rising body heat caused the metal to soften and slide away like steam. Free again, he shot after the villains. He knew the briefcase held something powerful that might be able to help All Might and that the confrontation could be dangerous, but he pressed on. On the roof, a helicopter was already lifting off. Izuku pushed himself into the air and reached the vehicle, forcing his way inside. He pulled David's shield clear and disrupted the villain's escape. The helicopter crashed onto the roof in a spectacular, non-graphic explosion. David's shield reassured Izuku that he would survive. The lead villain, Wolfram, seized the moment and placed a device on his head that caused metal to coil around him like armor and made his eyes glow ominously. A heavy steel beam knocked Izuku away from David's shield, sending him sliding across the rooftop. Izuku melted through the metal that pinned him with concentrated heat and charged back toward Wolfram. Steam rose from his wings and determination set his expression. Wolfram responded by launching metal pillars and bars toward him, but Izuku dodged and closed the distance. He punched through the remaining layers of armor and struck Wolfram, forcing the device from the villain's head. The metal armor collapsed and returned to its original form. Wolfram was incapacitated enough for Izuku to ensure David's shield was safe. After the incident, Izuku returned to the mainland with his classmates and close partners. The lull in League activity and the announcement of more quirk research lifted his spirits. Aizawa and Hisashi helped him adjust to the changes in his quirk and supported his recovery. The students of UA High grew even more admiring of Izuku, and his close companions remained by his side as his reputation rose. Years of hardship and struggle had shaped him into the person he became, the #1 hero known as Kizuato. Teleportation. The user can move themselves and objects anywhere in the universe. Drawback. None. Control. The user can physically control anyone by staring at them. Drawback. The user's eyes become irritated,